Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into one of the bleakest institutions ever designed by well-meaning bureaucrats, the 18th century English workhouse. Picture yourself stirring awake not in your comfortable bed, but on a straw mattress in a room packed with 60 desperate souls where the morning bell is about to shatter what little sleep poverty has allowed you. You're cold, you're hungry, and you probably won't survive this with your dignity intact, though historians still argue whether anyone's dignity survived the poor law system at all. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing this little community spread across the globe. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The bell begins at exactly 5 o'clock in the morning, though calling it a bell undersells the violence of the sound. It's more of a clanging assault, a metal-on-metal scream that ricochets off the bare walls of your dormitory and drills directly into whatever dreams you'd managed to cobble together. You jolt awake, and for a blessed half-second, you don't remember where you are. Then the cold hits you, the kind of cold that lives in buildings designed by people who believed suffering built character. Your eyes adjust to the pre-dawn darkness, and the reality settles back into your bones like an old disease. You're in the men's ward of the workhouse, lying on one of 60 wooden bed frames crammed so close together you could reach out and touch the stranger beside you without extending your arm fully. Not that you would. Everyone here has learned to exist in their own desperate bubble, eyes down, hands to yourself, thoughts carefully guarded behind expressions of careful neutrality. The straw mattress beneath you is compressed into something approaching a wooden plank after months of use. Your blanket, singular because this is 1750s England, and the concept of adequate bedding hasn't been invented yet, is a thin wool thing that smells of decades of unwashed bodies and institutional neglect. During the night, you've curled into a fetal position trying to conserve heat, and now your muscles protest as you unfold yourself into something resembling human posture. Around you, the dormitory comes reluctantly to life. 60 men in various states of physical decay begin the morning ritual of remembering they're still alive. Someone nearby coughs, a wet, rattling sound that speaks of consumption or something equally cheerful. Another man groans. A third sits up and immediately crosses himself, though what god would be hanging around a workhouse at 5 in the morning is anyone's guess. The air itself feels thick and used, a soup of breath and body heat and desperation that's been recycled through lungs all night. There's no glass in the high windows, just shutters that stay closed against the cold, so the room exists in a perpetual state of staleness that would make modern health inspectors weep into their clipboards. The smell is something you've almost gotten used to. Unwashed bodies, chamber pots, damp wool, and that indefinable scent of institutional poverty that seems to seep from the walls themselves. You swing your legs off the bed frame, and your bare feet hit the stone floor. The cold shoots up through your soles like an electric shock, though electricity won't be properly understood for another few decades. The flagstones are perpetually freezing, winter or summer, as if the building itself has decided that comfort is incompatible with moral improvement. You fumble for your shoes, if you can call them that. They're more like leather suggestions of shoes, worn through at the sole and held together by stubbornness and the absence of alternatives. The master's assistant appears in the doorway, a silhouette against the slightly lighter darkness of the corridor beyond. He doesn't say anything. He doesn't need to. The bell has spoken, and in the workhouse, the bell's word is law. You have precisely 15 minutes to make yourself presentable before roll call, though presentable in this context means upright and breathing. You reach for your clothes, which you've slept in because undressing requires both energy and optimism you don't possess. Your shirt is the same one you've worn for weeks, a linen thing that's gone from white to grey to a sort of defeated beige. Your breeches have patches on the patches. Your stockings have given up entirely on the concept of elasticity. But you're dressed technically, and that's what counts in this place where the bar for human dignity has been set somewhere below ground level. Around you, men shuffle into a rough formation. There's no talking. Conversation before roll call is discouraged in that special way Victorian institutions discourage things, where the rules aren't written down but everyone knows them anyway. You fall into line, one more grey figure in a grey room in a grey dawn, waiting for permission to begin another day of systematic dehumanization disguised as charity. The person who designed this system, you think distantly, probably slept in until 7 and took their morning tea in bed. Historians debate whether the workhouse system was meant to deter poverty or simply punish it, but standing here in the cold at 5 a.m, you're pretty sure you know the answer. Someone near the back vomits quietly into their chamber pot. Nobody reacts. This is just Tuesday in the machine designed to grind the poor into something resembling productive members of society, one freezing morning at a time. The line shuffles forward like a chain gang of exhausted ghosts, and you move with it through the corridor toward the washroom. The stone walls here are slick with condensation, and your fingers trail along the cold dampness as you steady yourself. Your body hasn't quite woken up yet, but the workhouse waits for no one's circadian rhythm. You can hear the sound ahead, the rhythmic squeak and splash of the pump handle, the muttered curses, the splash of water hitting stone. The washroom, when you reach it, is generosity with the word room. It's more of a stone chamber, maybe 20 feet square, with a drain in the centre that usually works and a single cast-iron pump that serves as the morning ablution station for 60 men. The queue extends out into the corridor, and you join the back of it, watching the men ahead of you take their turns with the mechanical efficiency of people who've done this dance 1,000 times before. There's one rule in the workhouse washroom: speed. You get perhaps 30 seconds at the pump before the pressure of bodies behind you becomes impossible to ignore. The man currently washing has stripped to the waist, brave soul, and is splashing water under his arms with the kind of grimacing determination usually reserved for medieval martyrs. The water coming from that pump is cold enough to make you question your life choices, and given that your life choices have landed you in a workhouse, that's saying something. You shuffle forward. The man ahead of you is perhaps 70, all ribs and papery skin, and you watch him approach the pump like a prisoner approaching the gallows. He works the handle with shaking arms, and the water gushes out in fits and starts, splashing onto the stone floor and creating puddles that never quite dry. He cups his hands, splashes his face, gasps like he's been stabbed, and moves on. The whole process takes maybe 20 seconds. Efficiency, you're learning, is the workhouse's only virtue. Now it's your turn. You step up to the pump, and the iron handle is so cold it almost burns your palm. You work it once, twice, and water spills into the shallow stone basin below. The temperature hits you like a physical blow. This isn't refreshing morning cold. This is January pond cold. This is your ancestors survived worse cold. You splash it onto your face anyway because the alternative is starting your day covered in yesterday's sweat and grime, and there are limits to how low you'll sink even in here. The water runs down your neck and soaks into your already questionable shirt. You work the pump again, trying to get your hands wet enough to at least approximate cleanliness. There's a bar of soap somewhere in the room. You've heard rumours of its existence, but in the crush of bodies and the pressure to move quickly, actually locating and using it feels like an impossible luxury. Most men just use water and friction and hope for the best. Historians debate whether the workhouse system's approach to hygiene was deliberately minimal or simply reflected broader 18th century attitudes toward bathing. But standing here with freezing water dripping from your chin, you're not particularly interested in the academic nuances. The mainstream historical fact is that regular bathing wasn't common among any class in this period. Even the wealthy might bathe only monthly, but the workhouse has managed to take casual hygiene neglect and systematize it into an art form. You splash water under your arms, trying not to think about the fact that 60 men share this single pump, this single basin, this single drain. The concept of individual towels hasn't made it to the workhouse. There's a communal rag hanging on a nail, but it's so damp and grey that using it would probably make you dirtier. Most men just air dry or wipe their faces on their sleeves, adding another layer of dampness to clothes that never quite dry anyway. Someone behind you clears their throat pointedly. You've been at the pump for maybe 25 seconds, which in workhouse time is approximately forever. You take one more handful of water, splash it across the back of your neck and step aside. The next man immediately takes your place, and the assembly line of minimal hygiene continues its joyless march. You move to the corner where chamber pots from the dormitory are emptied into a larger collection barrel. The smell here is rich enough to see, a physical presence that makes your eyes water. There's a quirky tidbit the historians love. Workhouses actually sold their collected waste to local farmers as fertilizer, creating a small revenue stream from human misery. You're literally contributing to the agricultural economy of England, one morning constitutional at a time. Your mother would be so proud. The drain in the centre of the room gurgles ominously, and you make a mental note to stand upwind of it. The floor is perpetually wet, a thin film of pump water, spilled chamber pot contents, and general dampness that makes every step treacherous. Men shuffle around in their worn shoes, trying not to slip, trying not to think too hard about what they're standing in. Against the far wall, there's a bench where a few men sit and attempt to shave using fragments of broken mirror propped against the stone. They share 2 straight razors between them, wiping the blades on their breeches between users. You haven't shaved in weeks. The effort required versus the benefit gained doesn't compute in your exhausted brain. Your beard is coming in patchy and unkempt, like everything else about your appearance, but vanity is another luxury you've learned to live without. The master's assistant appears in the doorway, surveying the room with the expression of someone who's seen it all and been disappointed by most of it. 5 minutes, he announces. Roll call in the yard. His tone suggests that lateness will be dealt with severely, though he doesn't specify how. He doesn't need to. Everyone knows. The remaining men at the pump work faster, splashing with increased urgency. You're already done, technically, though done is a relative term when you've essentially just redistributed the dirt rather than removed it. Your face is cold and wet, your shirt is soaked at the collar, and your hands smell like iron and ancient plumbing. This is as clean as you're getting today. You file back toward the corridor with the others, a damp and demoralized procession heading toward whatever fresh indignities the morning has prepared. Behind you, the pump squeaks on, and the drain continues its perpetual gurgle, and somewhere in England, a gentleman is probably enjoying his hot bath drawn by servants who heat the water over a fire. But that's not your England. Your England is cold water, shared pumps, and the growing realization that cleanliness might actually be next to godliness. But in the workhouse, you're not getting anywhere near either one. The dining hall is exactly what you'd expect from an institution that views food as fuel rather than pleasure. A long, narrow room with trestle tables arranged in rigid parallel lines and benches worn smooth by decades of miserable breakfasts. You file in with the others, finding your assigned spot on the bench through muscle memory rather than conscious thought. Nobody speaks. The silence in here is enforced not by rules but by the collective understanding that conversation requires energy better spent on surviving. The tables are bare wood, scarred with initials and crude drawings carved by inmates past, little acts of rebellion that say, I was here, I existed, I mattered. You run your finger over a set of initials near your usual spot, WT 1748, and wonder if WT made it out or died here. Statistically speaking, given the mortality rates, you're probably eating breakfast on a dead man's memorial. The wooden bowls arrive carried by inmates on serving duty, a rotating assignment that's somehow both coveted and despised. Coveted because you get to work in the kitchen where it's warm and there might be extra scraps. Despised because everyone knows you're getting those extra scraps and they hate you for it. The servers move down the tables with mechanical efficiency, placing a bowl before each person with a thunk that echoes in the cavernous room. Your bowl appears in front of you, and you look down at what the workhouse optimistically calls breakfast. It's gruel, or porridge, or skilly, depending on which regional term for grey sadness in a bowl you prefer. The mainstream historical fact is that workhouse gruel was typically made from oatmeal boiled in water, sometimes with a tiny amount of salt if the master was feeling generous. What's steaming weakly in your bowl is the result of that recipe taken to its most joyless extreme. The consistency is somewhere between soup and paste, a watery grey substance with the occasional lump that might be an oat, or might be something that fell into the pot and nobody noticed. It's hot, technically, which is the only positive thing you can say about it. The colour is that special shade of institutional beige grey that seems to exist only in buildings, designed to break the human spirit. If you painted a wall this colour, people would assume someone died there. You pick up your wooden spoon, no metal utensils in the workhouse, presumably because someone decided desperate people plus sharp objects equals problems, and stir the contents of your bowl. The gruel offers no resistance, just swirls in lazy, defeated circles. There's no butter, no sugar, no milk, Nothing that might transform this from technically edible to approaching food. This is nutrition reduced to its mathematical minimum. Enough calories to keep you working, not enough to let you think you deserve better. The man beside you, a fellow you've never spoken to despite sitting next to him for months, lifts his bowl directly to his lips and drinks. No spoon, no ceremony, just tilts it back and pours the gruel down his throat like medicine. Which, in a way, it is. Medicine against starvation. Medicine against death. Medicine that tastes like regret and boiled disappointment. You take a spoonful. The temperature is aggressively lukewarm, that perfect zone where it's too hot to burn but too cool to provide comfort. The taste is, well, calling it a taste is generous. It's more of an absence of taste, a blank space where flavour should be. Oats and water and sadness, boiled together until they surrendered their will to exist. You swallow, and it slides down your throat like an apology. Here's the quirky historical tidbit that might make you laugh if you weren't so hungry. Workhouse gruel was so notoriously awful that it became a measuring stick for poverty across England. If you were on the parish eating workhouse gruel, you'd hit absolute rock bottom. Even prisoners in jails often ate better. There are documented cases of inmates requesting transfer to actual prisons because the food was superior. Let that sink in. Literal criminals in literal prisons ate better than you're eating right now. You take another spoonful because stopping isn't an option. Your stomach, which has spent the night eating itself, accepts the gruel with the enthusiasm of someone who knows beggars can't be choosers. Around you, 60 men perform the same joyless ritual, spooning grey mush into their mouths with the mechanical efficiency of people who've learned not to think about what they're eating. There's no conversation, but there's noise, the scrape of wooden spoons on wooden bowls, the occasional cough, the slurp of men drinking directly from their bowls because dignity is rationed here more strictly than the food. Someone near the back gags, controls it, continues eating. You've seen men vomit up their breakfast and then eat it again rather than waste the calories. That hasn't happened to you yet, and you're taking that as a personal victory. The portion size is calculated with mathematical precision. Historians still argue whether workhouse masters deliberately kept rations minimal to deter people from seeking poor relief, or simply reflected budgetary constraints, but either way, you're looking at maybe 300 calories of gruel that will have to sustain you until the midday meal. That's not enough for the physical labour waiting after breakfast, and the workhouse masters know it. Hunger is part of the design, a constant companion meant to remind you that life outside these walls, no matter how desperate, was probably better than this. You scrape the bottom of your bowl, getting every last bit. There's no bread this morning. Bread comes at midday, just the gruel and the growing certainty that breakfast is something that happens to other people. People who don't live in workhouses, people who've made better choices or had better luck. The bowl before you is empty now, showing the grain of the wood through a thin film of grey residue. A bell rings, because of course there's another bell, signalling the end of breakfast. You've had maybe 7 minutes to eat. The servers return, collecting bowls with the same efficiency they delivered them. Your bowl disappears, and with it goes the last trace of what could generously be called a meal. You stand with the others, bench legs scraping against stone, and file toward the exit. Your stomach isn't full exactly, but it's less empty than it was, and in the workhouse economy of suffering, that counts as a win. Outside the dining hall, the morning's labour awaits, and you'll face it running on grey gruel and diminishing hope. But hey, at least you're not a prisoner. The prisoners get porridge with actual substance. Lucky bastards. From the dining hall you're herded, and that's really the only word for it, into the yard for morning roll call. The yard is a rectangular space enclosed by the workhouse walls, maybe 40 feet by 60, with packed dirt underfoot and a perpetual sense of being watched. Which you are. The master's quarters overlook this space from the second floor, and you can feel those windows like eyes on the back of your neck. You fall into line with practiced efficiency, finding your place in the formation by heightened dormitory assignment. The workhouse operates on military precision, because apparently someone decided that what desperate poor people really needed was to be organised like soldiers. 60 men arrange themselves in 4 rows of 15, standing at a rough attention in the grey morning light. The sun hasn't fully risen yet, and the yard exists in that pre-dawn gloom where everything looks slightly unreal. The cold is different out here, sharper, more honest than the damp chill inside. Your breath comes out in clouds, and you watch it dissipate into the morning air while you wait and wait. Because the first rule of institutional power is making people wait. It establishes who's in control, who matters, and who's just another body to be counted and catalogued. The master emerges from the main building like a minor aristocrat surveying his very disappointing kingdom. Master Thornby is a middle-aged man running to fat, dressed in a coat that's probably worth more than everything worn by everyone in this yard combined. He's not cruel by 18th century standards. He doesn't beat people for entertainment, but he's not kind either. He's a bureaucrat, a manager of misery, a man whose job is keeping 60 desperate people alive on minimal funding, while skimming enough off the top to maintain his own comfortable lifestyle. Behind him walks his assistant, a thin man with a ledger, because nothing in the workhouse happens without being written down, catalogued and filed away for some future audit, that will prove everyone followed the rules while people starved in technically legal ways. Master Thornby begins his walk down the first line, and you watch from your position in the third row. This is the daily inspection, where he checks whether anyone's died overnight, fallen seriously ill, or acquired contraband. The mainstream historical fact is that workhouse masters had broad authority over inmates, and were required to maintain daily records of the population, health status, and any disciplinary issues. What this meant in practice was a morning ritual of being looked at like livestock at market. He stops in front of the first man in line. "Open your mouth." The man complies, and Thornby peers in like he's examining a horse, checking for scurvy probably, or just checking that you still have teeth. Hard to work if your teeth fall out, though the workhouse would probably find a way to extract labour from your gums if necessary. Next, the inspection moves down the line with methodical slowness. Thornby pauses at a man who's coughing. "You, step forward." The man does, looking terrified, and Thornby examines him with the clinical detachment of someone deciding whether a tool is still useful. "Can you work?" The man nods frantically. "Then work. If you collapse, we'll discuss it then." Back in line. The message is clear. Illness is acceptable only at the point of absolute incapacity. You watch a younger man, maybe 20, get pulled aside for questioning. Apparently his pockets look suspiciously bulky. The assistant searches him and produces a crust of bread wrapped in cloth. The tension in the yard becomes palpable. Food hoarding is a serious offence in a place where every calorie is rationed and monitored. The man stammers an explanation. He was saving it for later. He gets so hungry in the afternoons. But Thornby's face hardens. 3 days in the refractory cell, no dinner today. The bread is confiscated, the man is led away, and the rest of you are reminded that even the smallest rebellion has consequences. Here's your quirky historical tidbit. Some workhouse masters became so obsessed with preventing food theft that they'd conduct surprise inspections of inmates' clothing, bedding, even checking under mattresses for hidden scraps. There are records of inmates being punished for hoarding apple cores. Apple cores. Because nothing says effective poverty management like punishing starving people for trying to be slightly less starving. Thornby reaches your row, and your spine straightens involuntarily. He walks past the man to your left, then stops in front of you. His eyes scan you up and down with the warmth of someone inventorying furniture. "You, when did you last bathe properly?" The question catches you off guard. "The washroom this morning, sir," he sniffs audibly. "Barely counts. You'll take extra washing duty this week." It's not a question. You nod. Arguing would be pointless and probably result in something worse. He moves on to the man beside you, and you release a breath you didn't know you were holding. Extra washing duty means scrubbing floors probably, or cleaning the chamber pots. Degrading but not dangerous. You'll take it. The inspection continues its crawl through the ranks. An older man is pulled aside for examination. His hands are shaking badly, and Thornby suspects palsy or drink. "Can you pick oakum?" Thornby asks. The man insists he can. Historians still argue whether workhouse masters genuinely tried to match labour to ability, or simply assigned whatever would be most cost-effective regardless of the human toll. But watching this exchange, you're developing theories. Someone near the back faints, just drops like a puppet with cut strings. There's a moment of collective held breath, then Thornby signals the assistant. "Get him to the infirmary. If he's dying, move him to the death room. If he's shamming, dock his meals." The efficiency is remarkable, really. 3 possible outcomes decided in 5 seconds, each one grim in its own special way. The master reaches the final row and turns to face the assembled group. "You are here," he announces, "by your own failures and God's will. The parish provides for you out of charity, and in return you will work. Any man who will not work shall not eat. Any woman who disrupts the household shall feel the consequences. Any child who fails to learn shall learn discipline instead." It's the same speech he gives every few days, a reminder that charity comes with conditions, and those conditions are enforced with institutional enthusiasm. Roll call concludes with the assistant reading names from the ledger, while each person responds with "Present, sir." Your name comes, your workhouse name stripped of dignity, reduced to inmate 47, male ward, and you respond on cue. The whole process takes maybe 20 minutes. 20 minutes of standing in the cold while a fat man in a warm coat confirms you haven't had the courtesy to die and save him the trouble of feeding you. "Dismissed to labour assignments," Thornby finally announces, and the formation breaks apart. You're alive, you're counted, you're documented. Another day in the machine begins, and you're one small cog trying desperately not to break. You shuffle with the others toward the work assignment area, a covered shed attached to the main building where the morning's labour is divvied up like cards in a cruel game you didn't choose to play. The overseer stands with his clipboard, always a clipboard in places like this, as if writing things down makes systematic misery more legitimate, and begins calling out names and tasks. Stoneyard, 10 men. A group peels off toward the outdoor work area where rocks wait to be broken into smaller rocks, which is apparently what England needs most from its poor people. Laundry, 5 women. Wrong group, but you hear them being directed toward the wash house where industrial-scale poverty laundry happens. Kitchen detail, 3 men. Lucky bastards. At least they'll be warm. Your name gets called with a group of 20 others. "Oakham room." The overseer's voice carries no sympathy, which is fair because sympathy isn't in his job description. You follow the group toward the oakum picking room with the enthusiasm of a man walking toward his own execution if executions were slow and involved significant finger damage. The oakum room is located in the basement level, because of course it is. You descend stone steps worn concave by decades of shuffling feet, and the temperature drops with each step. Cold air rises, warm air falls, and the workhouse has helpfully situated one of its primary labour rooms in the place where warmth goes to die. The room itself is long and low-ceilinged, with small windows set high in the walls that let in just enough light to see your misery by, but not enough to make it pleasant. Inside, wooden benches line both walls, and on these benches sit the tools of your trade, piles of old rope, specifically tarred rope from ships usually, thick twisted hemp cables that have spent years at sea absorbing saltwater, tar, and the tears of sailors. Your job for the next several hours is to pick these ropes apart fibre by fibre until you've reduced them to their component threads. This is called oakum, and it's used for caulking ships and packing pipes. Somewhere a ship's carpenter will use what you produce today to keep a vessel watertight, and he'll never know your name or care that your fingers are bleeding. You take your assigned spot on a bench. The woman, yes, woman, because the oakum room is one of the few places where gender segregation relaxes slightly. Across from you has been here longer than you. You can tell by her hands, which look like they've been through a war. Her fingers are calloused, scarred, and bent in ways fingers shouldn't bend. She doesn't look at you. Nobody makes eye contact in the oakum room. It's easier to pretend you're alone when you're performing this particular brand of soul-crushing labour. An overseer, different from the yard overseer, because the workhouse has a whole hierarchy of people whose job is watching you work, drops a section of rope in front of you. It's maybe 3 feet long, thick as your wrist, and stiff with dried tar. 2 pounds of oakum by dinner, he announces. Anyone short gets reduced rations. He doesn't wait for acknowledgement. The threat is enough. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Oakum picking was one of the most common forms of workhouse labour throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, considered ideal because it required no skill, could be done by people of any age or physical condition, and produced a genuinely marketable commodity. Workhouses sold their oakum to shipyards and made actual profit from the labour of people too poor to refuse. Capitalism at its finest, really, turning human suffering into naval supplies. You pick up the rope and begin. The technique is simple in theory. You pull the rope apart, separating the twisted strands, then pull those strands apart into smaller threads, then pull those threads into individual fibres until you've reduced a solid rope into a pile of fluffy hemp. Simple. In practice, It's like trying to tear apart steel cable with your bare hands while someone coats everything in glue. The tar is the main problem. Old dried tar creates a sticky, resistant surface that fights every attempt to separate the fibers. Your fingers slip and catch, and the rough hemp scrapes skin that's already raw from yesterday's work. You develop a rhythm: grip, twist, pull, grip, twist, pull. The rope yields reluctantly, millimetre by millimetre, and your pile of picked oakum grows with glacial slowness. After 10 minutes, your fingers start to hurt. After 20, they're actively protesting. After 30, you've entered a special realm of discomfort, where pain becomes white noise and you just keep working because stopping isn't an option. The hemp fibers work their way under your fingernails. The tar stains your skin black. Your hands develop a tremor from the repetitive motion, and you wonder distantly if this is what arthritis feels like. Around you, 20 other people perform the same task in silence. The only sounds are the whisper of fibre separating from fibre, the occasional grunt of effort, and the steady breathing of people who've learned to pace themselves for the long haul. Someone's stomach growls audibly. Someone else coughs, a deep wet sound that echoes off the stone walls. The overseer paces between the benches, watching for slackers, watching for anyone whose pile of oakum isn't growing fast enough. Here's your quirky tidbit. There are records of workhouse inmates developing a kind of oakum picker's callus, a specific pattern of toughened skin on the thumb and first two fingers that became so distinctive you could identify a long-term workhouse resident by their hands alone. Some people spent so many years picking oakum that their hands permanently curved into a claw shape, optimized for gripping tarred rope. Your body adapts to what you force it to do, even when what you force it to do is objectively terrible. You glance at your pile, maybe a £1/4 so far, and you've been working for an hour. £2 by dinner seems impossible, but so did waking up in a workhouse 6 months ago. And yet here you are, living proof that impossible is just another word for your life now. The child, because yes, there's a child on the bench near the back, maybe 10 years old, is crying quietly while she works. Nobody comforts her. Comfort isn't part of the system. Historians still argue whether using child labour in workhouses was considered normal for the era or recognised as cruel even by 18th century standards. But watching that little girl's fingers struggle with rope designed for grown men, you're forming your own opinions on the matter. Your thumb starts bleeding. Just a small split in the skin where the tar and hemp have worn through, but it stings like hell and makes every subsequent pull slippery with blood. You don't stop. Stopping means attention from the overseer, and attention means questions, and questions mean potentially reduced rations or punishment, or some other creative interpretation of work discipline. So you keep picking. Grip, twist, pull. Fibre by fibre, hour by hour, transforming ship's rope into ship's caulking, and your humanity into whatever's left after you've bled on tarred hemp for long enough. This is your morning. This is your job. This is the price of poverty in 1750s England. At least prisoners get to see the sky. Time moves differently in the oakum room. Minutes stretch into geological epochs, and hours become abstract concepts that exist somewhere outside the immediate reality of rope, tar, and bleeding fingers. You've lost track of how long you've been picking. Could be 2 hours, could be 4, but your pile of oakum has grown to maybe £1, which means you're halfway to your quota if you're lucky, and about to fail miserably if you're being realistic. The silence is the worst part, somehow worse than the pain. Not that it's actually silent. There's the constant whisper scrape of hemp being separated, the shuffle of people shifting on hard benches, the occasional cough or sigh, but there's no conversation, no human connection, just 20 isolated souls performing the same degrading task in proximity, but not community. The workhouse has found a way to make loneliness communal, which is impressive in its own horrible way. You look up briefly and catch the eye of the man 3 benches down. He's older, maybe 60, with a face like weathered leather, and hands that move through the oakum with the mechanical precision of someone who's been doing this for years. His expression is what you've come to recognise as the oakum picker's stare. Eyes open but not seeing anything, a 1,000-yard gaze that looks through the rope, through the walls, through reality itself to some distant point where this isn't happening anymore. You've started developing your own version of it, you realise, a mental retreat, a way of being present but not present, of existing without experiencing. The woman across from you, the one with the destroyed hands, has picked up her second section of rope and is working through it with grim efficiency. She's faster than you, her ruined fingers somehow more adept at separating the stubborn fibres. You wonder how long she's been here, whether she remembers what it's like to use her hands for anything other than this, whether she dreams about oakum, wakes up with phantom rope in her grip, whether there's anything left inside her besides the mechanical knowledge of how to transform one form of misery into another. Near the back, the child is still crying, though it's quieter now, just a steady stream of tears running down her face, while her small fingers struggle with rope sections that should never be in a child's hands. The mainstream historical fact is that children as young as 5 or 6 were regularly put to oakum picking in workhouses, because the Poor Law of 1722 specifically allowed parishes to use pauper children for labour. The thinking was that idle hands were the devil's workshop, and better to have children picking oakum than picking pockets. The fact that we're systematically destroying a 10-year-old's hands for naval supplies apparently seemed reasonable to someone, somewhere. Your left thumb has stopped bleeding but has formed a nice crusty scab that cracks open every few minutes with fresh blood. You've developed a technique of holding the rope differently to avoid putting pressure on the wound, which means you're slower now, which means you're falling further behind your quota. The math is simple and cruel. 2 pounds by dinner, you've got maybe £1.25 pounds, and you're losing speed as fatigue and injury compound. The overseer makes another circuit of the room. He stops behind you, and you feel his presence like a cold spot on your neck. He's checking your pile, doing the mental calculation of whether you're on track. The silence stretches. Pick faster, he finally says and moves on. That's it. No advice, no assistance, just a command to overcome physical limitations through sheer force of will. You'd laugh if you had the energy. Here's your quirky historical tidbit that might break your brain a little. Some workhouse records show that oakum pickers were required to produce between 2 to 5 pounds per day, depending on the institution, and that the fibre picking rate was carefully calculated based on the minimum speed a person could maintain while still being considered working. They did time motion studies in the 1750s. For oakum picking, someone with a pocket watch and a clipboard actually sat in rooms like this and mathematically determined the optimal rate of human degradation. That person probably went home to a nice dinner afterward and slept soundly. You return to your work because staring at the wall won't get you to 2 pounds. Grip, twist, pull. Your rhythm is slower now, more laboured, but it's still rhythm. Muscle memory takes over when conscious thought becomes too expensive, and your hands do what they've learned to do, even as your mind wanders to places that don't smell like tar and despair. The bench is hard beneath you, and your lower back has developed a deep ache from hunching over the work. There's no backrest, no cushion, nothing that might make the extended sitting bearable. Comfort would suggest that the people doing this labour deserve consideration, and the whole system is built on the premise that you don't. You're being reformed through suffering, improved through hardship, taught the value of honest work by performing the most soul-crushing labour imaginable for no pay. Someone across the room makes a sound. Not quite a sob, not quite a laugh, something in between that speaks of a mind approaching its limits. The overseer's head snaps toward the sound, hawk-like, but the person controls themselves and returns to silent picking. Close call. Emotional outbursts are punishable, because expressing the completely reasonable response to your circumstances would be disruptive to the orderly misery of others. The light from the high windows shifts as the morning crawls toward noon. You can track the passage of time by the angle of the sunbeams cutting through the dusty air, thin shafts of light that highlight the fibres floating in the atmosphere. You're breathing in hemp dust constantly, tiny particles that settle in your lungs with every breath. Historians still argue whether long-term oakum picking caused respiratory problems, but you don't need a historical study to tell you that inhaling visible amounts of industrial fibre probably isn't great for your health. Your pile has grown, slowly, painfully, bloodily, but it's grown. Maybe £1.50 pounds now, which means you might actually make quota if you maintain this pace and don't lose any more fingers to injury. Small victories. In the workhouse, you learn to celebrate the absence of additional misery rather than the presence of anything good. The woman with the ruined hands finishes her second section of rope and starts on a third. She's definitely going to make quota, probably exceed it. You wonder if she gets extra rations for exceeding expectations, or if the reward for working faster is just being given more work. Probably the latter. Efficiency in a workhouse means you've become too good at surviving the thing designed to make you stop being poor, which is its own special paradox. The child has switched from crying to a blank-faced silence that's somehow worse. She's still picking, still working, but something behind her eyes has shut down, some protective mechanism that removes her mentally from the physical reality of what's happening to her hands. You recognize the look. You're developing it yourself. The oakum picker's stare, that vacant 1,000-yard gaze that sees nothing and everything simultaneously. Your fingers cramp. A sharp, sudden seizing of the muscles that makes you drop your rope section. You flex your hands, trying to work out the spasm, and realize your fingers are curved into claws permanently shaped by the work. When you try to straighten them fully, they resist, as if your body is already adapting to a future where all you'll ever do is pick oakum until you die. You retrieve your rope section and continue. Because stopping isn't an option. Because dinner depends on this. Because the system grinds on whether you're in pain or not, and the only choice is whether to be ground down to dust or ground down to something that might survive another day. Grip, twist, pull. The rope yields its secrets fibre by fibre, and you yield yours too. Pieces of yourself left behind in every strand, every drop of blood mixed with tar, every moment of humanity sacrificed to the god of systematic poverty relief. The oakum room has no clock, but you don't need one. You can feel dinner approaching by the level of hunger gnawing at your insides and the growing pile of fibre before you. Almost there, almost enough, almost time for this particular suffering to pause and different suffering to begin. Almost. The bell rings for midday dinner, and the sound is somehow both a relief and a reminder that you're still trapped in a system that measures your life in bell intervals. You set down your rope section. Your pile has reached approximately 1.8 pounds, which is close enough that you're hoping the overseer won't measure too carefully, and flex your fingers. They don't want to unflex. Your hands have essentially frozen into oakum-picking position, clawed and stiff, and it takes several seconds of conscious effort to convince them they're allowed to be a different shape now. The procession to the dining hall is quieter than the morning shuffle. Everyone's exhausted from 4 hours of labour, and conversation requires calories nobody has to spare. You file in with the others, and there's a grim satisfaction in sitting down on a bench after hours of picking oakum on a harder bench. It's like the workhouse has created tiers of discomfort, and you're grateful for moving one tier up, which is a depressing statement about how low your standards have fallen. The dining hall looks exactly as it did at breakfast, because workhouses don't redecorate between meals. Same scarred tables, same worn benches, same general atmosphere of institutional depression. You take your spot, and within moments the servers begin their rounds. But this time, instead of bowls, they're carrying wooden boards stacked with the midday meal. Your portion arrives, bread and cheese. Well, bread and cheese if we're being generous with our definitions. The bread is dark, dense, and looks like it was baked sometime during the previous geological era. It's the kind of bread that requires serious jaw muscles and optimistic dentistry. The mainstream historical fact is that workhouse bread was typically made from the cheapest available grain, often barley, rye, or even bean flour mixed with wheat, and was deliberately baked to be heavy and filling rather than palatable. The theory was that dense bread stretched further and kept people full longer, though full might be overstating what this bread accomplishes. You pick up your portion, it's roughly the size of your fist, which in workhouse measurements equals about 6 ounces. The crust is so hard you could probably use it as a construction material. The inside, when you break it open, is dense and slightly damp, with the kind of texture that suggests the baker's primary goal was creating something that wouldn't spoil for several days, rather than something humans would enjoy eating. But then there's the cheese. Oh, the cheese. Calling it cheese requires optimism that historians still debate the philosophical existence of. It's a yellowy-grey lump about the size of 2 fingers, sitting on your board like a confession of culinary defeat. The texture is somewhere between rubber and sadness. The smell is challenging. Not quite rancid, but definitely not fresh, existing in that ambiguous zone where you can't tell if it's supposed to smell like that or if something has gone terribly wrong. You've learned that workhouse cheese is typically the absolute cheapest available, often the scraps and end pieces that regular markets won't sell. Sometimes it's cheese that's started to turn and been salvaged with salt. Sometimes it's not entirely clear what animal the milk came from, or whether the word cheese is being used in its traditional sense or more as a hopeful description of aged milk solids that haven't killed anyone yet. The man beside you, still the same man you never speak to, breaks his bread with his hands because a knife would be A, a weapon, and B, unnecessary when you could just beat the bread against the table until it surrenders. He tears off a chunk, places a sliver of cheese on it, and eats the combination with the enthusiasm of someone taking medicine. Which is accurate. This isn't food for pleasure, this is fuel, nothing more. You follow his example. The bread requires serious chewing. Your jaw works overtime, grinding the dense mass into something your throat might accept. The texture is simultaneously dry and somehow damp, which shouldn't be physically possible, but here we are. It tastes like poverty mainly. That specific flavour that comes from using the cheapest ingredients and the minimum effort. There's a hint of grain, a suggestion of staleness, and an overall impression of, this will keep you alive, and that's literally all we're promising. Then you add the cheese. The combination doesn't improve things. The cheese has a tangy, sharp flavour that isn't quite right. Like milk that's gone on an unauthorised adventure and returned changed. It's salty, very salty, which probably explains how it's been preserved past its natural expiration date. When you chew bread and cheese together, the flavours don't complement each other so much as engage in a brief, joyless conflict in your mouth before you swallow out of pure necessity. Here's your quirky historical tidbit. There are documented cases of workhouse cheese being so hard that inmates would save pieces to use as dominoes or gaming pieces during their rare recreation periods. The cheese was literally more useful as a toy than as food. Some workhouses had to forbid the practice because people were hoarding their cheese for non-eating purposes, which says something profound about the quality of the cheese you're currently forcing down your throat. Around you, 60 people perform the same cheerless meal. There's more noise than at breakfast. The crack of hard bread breaking, the sound of serious chewing, the occasional grunt of effort as someone works through a particularly dense section. Someone near the back is dunking their bread in water from a cup, trying to soften it enough to eat without breaking a tooth. That's not technically allowed, but the overseer present isn't stopping it, probably because he recognises that preventing tooth loss might reduce medical costs down the line. Your hands hurt as you eat. The oakum picking has left your fingers stiff, cut, and stained with tar that no amount of cold water washing will fully remove. Holding the bread requires grip strength you don't quite have, and the crust cuts into wounds that are still fresh. But you eat anyway because the alternative is starving, and starvation is permanent while pain is merely constant. The portion disappears faster than you'd like. 6 ounces of bread and maybe an ounce of cheese is not enough for a body that's been picking oakum for 4 hours and will be breaking stones all afternoon. Your stomach accepts the offering with confusion. It's less empty than before, but not actually satisfied. Historians still argue whether workhouse rations were deliberately calculated to keep inmates hungry as a deterrent, or simply reflected budgetary constraints. But the effect is the same either way. You're functioning on a caloric deficit that's slowly eating away at your body mass. No water is provided at the table. There's a pump in the yard you can use after the meal if you're dying of thirst. So you swallow the dry bread and drier cheese and hope your throat doesn't revolt. The combination sits heavy in your stomach, a dense lump of questionable nutrition that will have to sustain you for the next several hours of physical labour. The meal, such as it was, is over in perhaps 10 minutes. The servers return to collect the wooden boards, and you stand with the others, bench legs scraping stone in a sound that's become the soundtrack of your institutional life. Your stomach isn't satisfied, but it's less angry than it was, and in the workhouse economy of suffering that counts as lunch being successful. Outside, the afternoon waits with rocks that need breaking, and a system that needs feeding with your labour. But for these 10 minutes, you've eaten bread and cheese, and you're still alive to complain about it, which means today is not yet a complete loss. Though calling that substance cheese remains generous enough to qualify as fiction. From the dining hall, you're herded into the yard where the afternoon's entertainment awaits. Stone breaking. If oakum picking was the morning's assault on your fine motor skills, stone breaking is the afternoon's attack on everything else. You file out with a group of 15 men, a different group from the oakum room because the workhouse likes to spread the misery around democratically, toward the stone yard, which is exactly what it sounds like, a yard with stones in it. The stone yard is a section of the main courtyard that's been dedicated to housing piles of rocks in various stages of being smashed into smaller rocks. The concept is beautifully simple. Large stones arrive from quarries, you break them into medium stones, then break those into small stones, then break those into gravel, and somewhere in England someone uses that gravel to build roads or drainage systems or whatever it is that requires an endless supply of hand-broken stone. It's outdoor work, which sounds like an improvement until you remember it's December in England and you're wearing clothes that wouldn't keep a scarecrow warm. The tools are distributed by yet another overseer. The workhouse has more overseers than seems strictly necessary, like they're worried one might miss an opportunity to witness suffering, and you receive yours with the resignation of someone who knows what's coming. It's a hammer, not a fancy hammer, not a specialized stone-breaking hammer, just a heavy iron hammer with a wooden handle worn smooth by decades of desperate hands. The mainstream historical fact is that workhouse stone-breaking was typically done with simple hammers weighing between 3 and 7 pounds, and you'd swing this hammer thousands of times per day to meet your quota. Your assigned stone pile sits before you, rough chunks of limestone, each piece ranging from fist size to slightly larger than your head. Your quota is simple and brutal. Fill one basket with gravel by day's end. The basket sits empty beside your pile, mocking you with its capacity. It's maybe 3 feet across and 2 feet deep, and you're expected to fill it with stones you've personally reduced to pieces no larger than your thumbnail. The math is depressing. Hundreds, maybe thousands of hammer strikes, all powered by arms that are already tired from the morning's oakum picking and fueled by 6 ounces of bread and questionable cheese. You pick up a medium-sized stone, set it on the ground, and raise your hammer. The technique, such as it is, involves hitting the stone hard enough to break it, but not so hard that fragments fly into your face, or God forbid, someone else's face. You bring the hammer down. The impact jars through your arms, up into your shoulders, and the stone doesn't break. It just sits there, smug and intact, probably laughing at you in whatever language stones speak. You hit it again, and again. On the 4th strike, it finally splits, revealing a lighter interior and creating 2 new pieces that need breaking. Congratulations! You've transformed one problem into 2 smaller problems. This is progress, apparently. Around you, 14 other men perform the same task with varying degrees of success. The sound is incredible. Not loud exactly, but persistent. A constant percussion of metal on stone that echoes off the workhouse walls and probably drives the master insane in his comfortable quarters. Crack, crack, crack. A rhythmic soundtrack of poverty being transformed into road materials, one hammer blow at a time. The cold is sharp out here, a wind that cuts through your threadbare clothes and reminds you that outdoor work in an English winter is its own special kind of punishment. Your fingers, already damaged from oakum picking, now have to grip a hammer handle that feels like ice. Within 10 minutes, you've lost feeling in your fingertips. Within 20, your hands are so cold that you're worried the hammer might slip and you'll break your foot instead of the stones, which would be unfortunate because the workhouse infirmary's approach to foot injuries is probably walk it off. Here's your quirky tidbit that'll warm your heart about as much as this wind is warming your fingers. Stone breaking was considered one of the more humane forms of workhouse labour because it was done outdoors and didn't require the close confinement of the oakum room. Reformers of the era actually praised stone breaking as healthy exercise, outdoor air, physical activity, character building. The fact that you're slowly destroying your shoulders and developing what will eventually be called repetitive stress injury apparently didn't factor into their enthusiasm. You work through your pile methodically. Each stone requires multiple strikes. Some need 5 hits, some need 20. Some seem to be made of pure spite and require extended negotiations with your hammer before they consent to break. The technique matters. Hit the edge and the stone might split cleanly. Hit the center and it might just absorb the impact and laugh at you. You're developing an intuition for stone grain, for weak points, for the subtle differences between limestone that will break and limestone that will ruin your afternoon. Your shoulders start burning after the first hour. The repetitive motion of raising a 7-pound hammer and bringing it down with force is not what human shoulders were designed for, and yours are filing formal complaints through the medium of acute pain. Your lower back joins the protest, bent over stones, while your upper body does the hammering. Your forearms feel like they're on fire. Even your neck hurts from looking down constantly. But you keep swinging because the basket won't fill itself, and your dinner portion depends on meeting quota. The workhouse has a beautiful system. Work determines food, food determines ability to work, and if you can't work enough to earn food, well, that sounds like a personal problem solved by starvation. It's efficient, really, in a horrifying sort of way. The man beside you is maybe 50, all sinew and gristle, and he works with a steady rhythm that suggests this isn't his first month in the stone yard. His pile diminishes faster than yours, stones breaking with satisfying cracks while yours seem to require extensive counselling before they split. He doesn't look at you, doesn't offer advice, just swings his hammer with the mechanical precision of someone who's learned that conversation burns calories better spent on survival. Historians still argue whether the stone-breaking quotas were based on actual capacity studies or simply arbitrary numbers designed to ensure maximum labour extraction. But watching your empty basket and your still large stone pile, you're developing strong opinions on the matter. The quota seems designed to be just barely achievable if you work constantly without breaks, which means breaks aren't really an option unless you're fond of going to bed hungry. A younger man, maybe 25, drops his hammer and clutches his shoulder, face twisted in pain. The overseer walks over, examines him with the clinical interest of someone evaluating a malfunctioning machine and says, "Pick it up or lose dinner." The man, tears in his eyes, picks up the hammer. The overseer nods and moves on. Compassion isn't in the workhouse budget, apparently, though there seems to be plenty of funding for overseers to stand around ensuring nobody experiences a moment of rest. Your hands are bleeding again. The hammer handle rubs against wounds from the morning's oakum picking, and every swing opens them a little more. Blood mixes with stone dust on your palms, creating a gritty paste that makes gripping even harder. You don't stop. Stopping means attention. Attention means problems. Problems mean punishment or reduced rations or both. The basket is maybe 1/4 full now, which means you're on pace if you maintain this rate and don't, say, collapse from exhaustion or accidentally break your own hand. Small victories. In the workhouse, success is measured in degrees of not quite failing, and you're hovering somewhere in that zone. Crack, crack, crack. The afternoon grinds on, measured in hammer strikes and broken stones and the slow filling of a basket that will prove you've earned the right to eat again tonight. This is your life now. Smashing rocks because you're poor, staying poor because you're smashing rocks, trapped in a circular system that grinds you down as surely as you're grinding down limestone. At least the view is nice. If by nice you mean brick walls and the back of other people's heads. So basically, exactly as nice as everything else in this place. You're midway through splitting a particularly stubborn piece of limestone when you hear them, high, thin voices reciting in unison from somewhere above. You look up, hammer paused mid-swing, and see them through the windows of the second-floor schoolroom. Children. Maybe 20 of them, all under 12, standing in rows and chanting something that sounds like multiplication tables or biblical verses, or possibly both. Their faces are pale ovals pressed against the glass, watching the stone yard below with the kind of fascination that comes from having nothing else to look at. They're workhouse children, the offspring of paupers or orphans, or children whose parents are somewhere in this building, but might as well be on the moon given the strict segregation rules. The mainstream historical fact is that by the 1750s, most workhouses maintained some form of educational program for children, partly out of genuine reformist impulse, and partly because Parliament required it. The theory was that educating poor children would break the cycle of poverty. The reality, as you're witnessing, is that you can educate children all you want, but if the only future available to them involves more workhouses, you're really just teaching them to be literate paupers. A small girl, maybe 7, has her nose pressed against the glass and she's staring directly at you. Her eyes are too large for her face, the way children's eyes get when they're not getting enough food. You wave slightly with your free hand, a tiny gesture of acknowledgement, and she startles back from the window as if you've done something forbidden. Which you probably have. Fraternization between working inmates and children is likely discouraged because God forbid anyone experience a moment of human connection in this place. The schoolmaster's shadow moves across the window and the children snap back to attention. The chanting resumes, louder now, more urgent. You can't make out the words from down here in the stone yard, but the rhythm is unmistakable. Rote memorization, that ancient educational technique that assumes drilling information into young minds, will somehow compensate for the fact that those minds are housed in hungry, scared bodies, trapped in an institution designed to punish their parents' poverty. You return to your stone breaking, but now you're aware of the audience. 20 pairs of eyes watching you smash rocks, learning what their future looks like. Because that's what they're really learning up there, isn't it? Not reading and arithmetic and moral improvement. Those are just the official curriculum. The real lesson is happening right now. This is what happens to poor people. This is what your life will be. Get used to disappointment. Here's your quirky historical tidbit that's more depressing than quirky. Workhouse schools often taught children trade skills specifically useful within workhouse settings. Girls learned sewing and laundry, boys learned oakum picking and stone breaking, all under the guise of practical education. They were essentially training children to be better workhouse inmates, creating an educated underclass perfectly suited for institutional poverty. Some reformers recognized this and complained about it. Most didn't. Most figured poor children needed to learn their place, and their place was picking oakum with proper technique. The chanting stops, and there's a moment of silence before a different sound emerges. A small voice reading aloud, halting and uncertain. Someone's learning to read, struggling through text while their classmates wait in line for their turn. You remember learning to read, back when your life was different, back when the future held possibilities beyond break rocks and pick oakum. That seems like a different person, a different lifetime. The you who learned to read had parents, had a home, had dreams that didn't involve quotas and gruel. The you smashing limestone in a workhouse yard is someone else entirely. The schoolroom window opens, brave move in this cold, and you hear the words more clearly now. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Psalms, they're learning psalms. The irony is so thick you could break it with your hammer. I shall not want. Except these children want everything. They want food, they want warmth, they want their parents, they want lives that don't involve institutionalization before they've lost their baby teeth. But sure, teach them that the Lord provides while they're starving in a building designed by people who definitely aren't starving. One of the boys near the window can't be more than 6 and he's crying. Silent tears rolling down his face while he recites scripture about not wanting. The schoolmaster's hand appears, swats the back of his head. Not hard enough to injure, just hard enough to remind him that crying is weakness, and weakness is unacceptable. The boy controls himself, wipes his face with his sleeve, continues reciting. You want to climb through that window and tell the schoolmaster exactly where he can put his hand, but that would require energy you don't have and courage that's been systematically beaten out of you over months of institutional life. Historians still argue whether workhouse education genuinely aimed to improve children's prospects, or simply created a more docile, literate labour force for future exploitation. Watching those kids recite psalms while their bodies slowly starve, you're landing firmly on the exploitation side of the debate. Education should open doors, but in the workhouse, it just teaches children to read the signs on the doors that are closing in their faces. The girl who waved at you earlier is back at the window. She's mouthing something, and it takes you a moment to realise she's asking a question. Are you my papa? Your heart does something complicated and painful in your chest. You shake your head slowly. She looks disappointed but not surprised, like she asks every man in the yard the same question, hoping one will eventually say yes. Somewhere in this building, her father might actually be picking oakum or breaking different stones, separated from her by the system's obsessive need to keep families apart while helping them. The children's lessons continue through the afternoon, their voices occasionally drifting down to the stone yard where men break rocks to the rhythm of education happening overhead. It's a strange counterpoint. Young voices learning what they're supposed to become, adult bodies demonstrating what they actually become, separated by one flaw and an entire system of social control that ensures poverty reproduces itself generation after generation. A boy appears in a different window, older, maybe 11, and he's just staring at the stonebreakers with an expression you recognize. Resigned acceptance. He knows. He already knows that this is his future, that in a few years he'll be down here with a hammer, breaking rocks until his shoulders give out, living on gruel and bread and the thin hope that something, somewhere, somehow will change. But nothing will change. Nothing ever changes in places like this. The wheel turns, the poor stay poor, and children learn to read so they can better understand the ledgers that document their own exploitation. The schoolmaster closes the window, shutting out the cold and shutting in the children. The voices become muffled again, indistinct, just background noise to the crack, crack, crack of hammers on stone. You return your full attention to your basket, which is maybe half full now, which means you're falling behind quota, which means you need to work faster despite arms that are screaming and hands that are bleeding. But you can't stop thinking about that little girl's face, the way she asked if you were her father, the hope and hopelessness tangled together in a 7-year-old's expression. This is what the workhouse does to children. Turns them into small, scared creatures who've learned that adults disappear, that families break apart, that love is less reliable than the morning bell. Above you, the lessons continue. Children learn their letters and their numbers and their scripture, preparing for a future that's already written in the stones you're breaking and the system you're trapped in. Education should be liberation. In the workhouse, it's just another form of control, teaching children to be grateful for the rocks they'll someday break and the gruel they'll someday eat and the beds they'll someday share with 60 strangers who smell like defeat. At least they can read about freedom. That's something. That's more than nothing. It just looks a lot like nothing from down here in the stone yard. Your hammer comes down wrong. Not disastrously wrong, but wrong enough that the stone fragment ricochets and catches you on the shin. The pain is sharp and immediate, like someone's jabbed a hot needle through your threadbare stocking and into the bone beneath. You drop the hammer, clutch your leg, and bite down hard on a curse that would probably earn you punishment if the overseer heard it. When you pull up your stocking to look, there's a gash maybe 2 inches long, bleeding freely enough to be concerning, but not quite freely enough to be an emergency. The overseer notices because overseers notice everything, especially potential disruptions to the smooth operation of their misery machine. He walks over, looks at your leg with the clinical detachment of someone evaluating whether a horse can still pull a cart. Can you work? It's not really a question. You nod because the alternative is being sent to the sick ward, and from what you've heard, the sick ward is where people go to discover that illness in the workhouse is worse than illness anywhere else. Then work, he says, and that's that. Medical assessment complete. You tie your stocking tighter around the wound, creating a makeshift bandage that will probably lead to infection, but at least stops the immediate bleeding. Your leg throbs with each heartbeat, a new source of pain to add to the comprehensive collection you've developed since arriving here. You pick up your hammer and return to the stones because stopping isn't an option, and the sick ward isn't an improvement. But your curiosity has peaked now, or maybe it's morbid fascination. During the brief water break, 10 minutes at the yard pump, a generosity that suggests even the workhouse recognizes that dehydration reduces labor productivity. You position yourself near the building's east wing where, according to whispered institutional knowledge, the sick ward is located. You can see it from here. A row of windows on the ground floor, some of them propped open despite the cold, presumably to air out whatever diseases are breeding in there. Through one window, you catch a glimpse of the interior. The sick ward is a long room, maybe 40 feet by 20, with what looks like straw pallets arranged on the floor. Not beds. Actual beds would suggest too much care. Just pallets, thin mattresses of straw on wooden platforms barely raised above the stone floor. The mainstream historical fact is that workhouse infirmaries in the 18th century were typically under-equipped and overcrowded with minimal medical supplies and rarely more than basic palliative care. What you're seeing confirms this. A warehouse for sick people. Storage rather than treatment. A figure moves past the window, someone in a patient's shift, grey and shapeless, and you can see even from here that they're seriously ill. The way they move, hunched and shuffling, speaks of pain that's become a constant companion. They disappear from view, and another figure replaces them at the window, an older woman, maybe 60, with a face that's more skull than flesh. She's just standing there, staring out at the yard, and her expression is what you imagine death looks like when it's trying to be patient. Back to work, the overseer calls, and the water break is over. You return to your stones, but the image of that window stays with you. The sick ward isn't just a place where ill people go, it's where the workhouse admits defeat, where bodies that can't produce labour are stored until they either recover or don't, and recovery seems like the less common outcome. Here's your quirky tidbit that's about as fun as everything else in this place. Many workhouses employed part-time medical officers, doctors who visited perhaps once or twice a week for an hour or two, to treat all illnesses among populations that could number in the hundreds. These doctors were paid minimal fees and often viewed workhouse duty as the least prestigious medical work available. So when you're dying of typhus or consumption in the sick ward, You're being treated by a doctor who's probably there under protest, getting paid perhaps a few pounds per year, and who's already mentally planning their escape to literally any other medical practice. Between hammer strikes, you piece together what you know about the sick ward from overheard conversations and institutional rumours. There's a part-time doctor, comes Tuesday and Friday if you're lucky, Thursday and never if you're not, who makes rounds and decides who gets the limited medicine supply. Apparently, his decision-making process involves evaluating whether you're likely to recover and return to work, or whether you're a sunk cost better left to Providence. If you're old, weak, or expensively ill, Providence becomes your primary care physician. The sick ward also serves as the antechamber to the death room. Yes, there's a death room. A separate space where people actively dying are moved so their final moments don't disturb the sick people who might actually recover. Historians still argue whether this separation was meant to be merciful, sparing the dying from the noise of the sick ward, or simply efficient, keeping those who might live separate from those who definitely won't. Either way, there's a room in this building specifically designated for death, which says something profound about how the workhouse views its inhabitants. Your leg is throbbing steadily now, keeping time with your hammer strikes. The bleeding has stopped mostly, but you can feel the wound trying to decide whether it wants to heal or fester. Infection is a real possibility. You're working in dirt and stone dust, your stocking is filthy, and the workhouse's approach to wound care is basically hope for the best. If the wound does get infected, you'll face a choice. Keep working and risk losing the leg, or report to the sick ward and risk losing everything else. A man 2 positions down from you collapses, just drops like a puppet with cut strings, his hammer clattering against the stones. The overseer is there immediately, checking for signs of life, and finding them, though barely. Get him to the sick ward, he orders 2 other workers, who drop their hammers and haul their fallen comrade toward the east wing like they're moving a sack of grain. The unconscious man's head lolls, and you wonder if he's experiencing heat stroke in December, or if his body has simply decided it's had enough of this whole being alive in a workhouse situation. The sick ward door opens to receive him, and for a brief moment you see inside. Rows of pallets, grey shapes lying on them in various states of distress, and a smell that reaches you even from across the yard. A thick, sweet rot smell of unwashed bodies and sickness and chamber pots that haven't been emptied frequently enough. The door closes. The man is inside now, and you wonder if you'll see him again, or if he's just graduated from rock breaking to dying, skipping several intermediate steps. You return to your work because standing around contemplating mortality doesn't fill baskets with gravel. Your leg hurts, your shoulders hurt, everything hurts, but you're upright and conscious, which makes you one of the lucky ones. The sick ward is there, waiting for everyone who stumbles, everyone who falls ill, everyone whose body can't maintain the impossible pace the workhouse demands. It's not a hospital, it's not even really an infirmary. It's a holding pen where the broken are kept until they're either fixed or disposed of. Through the window, you can still see the old woman still staring out at the yard. She hasn't moved. Maybe she can't move. Maybe she's already dead and nobody's noticed yet. In the sick ward, you've heard, the difference between the very ill and the recently deceased isn't always immediately obvious. And sometimes the morning rounds involve discovering which category people have moved into overnight. Your basket is 3/4 full now, your leg is screaming, your hands are bleeding, but you're not in the sick ward, which means you're winning technically. The bar for success in this place is set so low it's practically underground, and you're managing to stay above it for another day. The hammer comes down, the stone breaks, the basket fills, and in the sick ward people lie on straw pallets and wait for a part-time doctor to decide whether they're worth saving. Spoiler alert, most of them aren't. The overseer calls an end to stone breaking an hour before supper, which is either mercy or simply logistics. They need time to count baskets and assign tomorrow's work. You straighten up and your spine makes sounds that no spine should make, a series of pops and cracks that suggest your vertebrae are filing for early retirement. Your basket is full, technically, though you suspect it's about 90% full and you've arranged the top layer to make it look more impressive. The overseer gives it a cursory glance, nods, and marks something in his ledger. You've passed. Today, you eat. The stone yard empties as men drag themselves toward the wash pump to rinse off the worst of the rock dust before supper. But here, in the yard's corner where men wait in loose clusters for the dinner bell, you start to notice things. The social architecture beneath the institution's formal structure. The way certain men stand slightly apart receives slightly more deference. The way information flows through specific channels, like water finding the path of least resistance through a hierarchy you didn't know existed. There's Jenkins, for instance. He's maybe 40, been in the workhouse for 3 years according to rumour, and he's positioned himself as the unofficial intermediary between inmates and the master. Not officially, there's no title, no formal role, but everyone knows that if you need something, if you want to request different work or report someone for stealing your bread or get a message to a family member in the women's wing, you go through Jenkins. He stands now against the wall, arms crossed, receiving a steady stream of quiet conversations from men who approach him like supplicants before a minor deity. Jenkins gets extra rations, the man beside you mutters, so quietly you almost miss it. It's the first time he's spoken to you in months of sitting next to each other. From the master, for keeping order, like making sure there's no trouble, no organising, no complaints that reach outside these walls. The mainstream historical fact is that workhouse masters frequently employed informal systems of inmate hierarchy to manage their populations. It was cheaper than hiring additional staff and more effective than formal discipline alone. You watch Jenkins accept something from another inmate, a button, maybe, or a small coin, and nod. Payment for services rendered. The workhouse might officially forbid commerce between inmates, but unofficially, a whole economy exists, trading rations, exchanging favours, buying protection or information, or simply the courtesy of being left alone. Jenkins sits at the centre of this web, taking his cut, maintaining order, and ensuring the master never has to deal with the messy reality of actually managing desperate people. Then there's the kitchen crew, 3 men who work food service and have, through proximity to actual sustenance, become a kind of aristocracy. You can identify them by their slightly less gaunt faces, the way their clothes are marginally less threadbare. They control access to the one resource that matters most in a place where everyone's starving: extra food. A crust of bread that accidentally doesn't make it to the table. A bowl of gruel that's slightly fuller than regulation. These aren't huge advantages, but in the workhouse economy, they're the difference between surviving and thriving. One of the kitchen crew, Thomas you think his name is currently negotiating with an older inmate. You can't hear the words, but the body language is clear. The older man is offering something Thomas is considering, weighing the offer against whatever internal calculus he uses to determine who gets favours and who doesn't. Finally, Thomas nods, and the older man's shoulders sag with relief. A deal has been struck. Extra rations tonight, probably, in exchange for what? Labour? Information? Something stolen from another inmate? The currency of workhouse politics is varied and always depressing. Here's your quirky historical tidbit. Some workhouses developed such complex internal hierarchies that reformers compared them to criminal organisations, with various inmates controlling different rackets. Food distribution, work assignments, access to the master, even control over sleeping positions in the dormitory. There are documented cases of workhouse riots starting not because of official policies, but because someone disrupted the informal power structure, and everyone's delicate survival calculations collapsed into chaos. You're learning the unwritten rules now, the ones that matter more than anything in the official workhouse regulations. Rule 1. Keep your mouth shut about what you see. The man who reports Jenkins' side business will find himself with the worst work assignments and accidentally short rations until he leaves or dies. Rule 2. Figure out what you have to trade. Your labour, your silence, your willingness to look the other way. Everything has value if you can find the right buyer. Rule 3. Never challenge the hierarchy directly. It exists for a reason, and that reason is keeping the whole desperate system from collapsing into violence. The man beside you, the one who finally spoke, continues in his quiet voice. See Collins there? The one with the limp? You nod. Collins is standing near Jenkins, conferring about something. He's the master's eyes in the dormitory, reports on who's talking about what, who's planning what, who's complaining too loud, gets a bed near the stove for his trouble, warmer than the rest of us by maybe 5 degrees, which in here counts as luxury. So Collins is an informer. Good to know. You file this information away, add it to your growing map of who to trust, nobody, and who to avoid, everybody, but especially Collins. The workhouse isn't just an institution. It's an ecosystem complete with predators, parasites, and the vast majority of creatures just trying not to get eaten. Historians still argue whether these informal hierarchies were inevitable results of grouping desperate people together, or whether workhouse masters deliberately fostered them as control mechanisms. Watching Jenkins collect his tributes, and Collins slink toward the master's building with information to sell, you're thinking it's probably both. The masters didn't create this system, but they definitely encouraged it, fed it, let it grow, because it made their jobs easier. A younger man, new, maybe 2, weeks in, approaches Jenkins without understanding the protocol. He just walks up and starts talking, no payment offered, no proper deference shown. The conversation is brief. Jenkins says something sharp and the young man backs away, confused and probably about to learn some hard lessons about how things work here. Within a day or 2, he'll either figure out the system or become its victim. There's no middle ground. Why doesn't anyone fight back, you ask your suddenly talkative neighbour? Against Jenkins, against the whole system? He gives you a look that's equal parts pity and disbelief. Because fighting back means you're troublemaker. Troublemakers get the refractory cell, get reduced rations, get the worst work, get their names sent to other workhouses so you can't escape to somewhere better. And if you really fight back, if you hurt Jenkins or one of the master's pets, they'll have you up for assault and you'll hang. The system's got teeth, friend. Best to learn that now. The bell rings for supper formation, and the yard's clusters dissolve as men move toward their assigned positions. But the hierarchy doesn't dissolve, it just becomes less visible, flowing beneath the surface of the formal structure like underground water. Jenkins will eat well tonight, better than his official ration. Thomas will distribute his favours and collect his payments. Collins will deliver his intelligence to the master and sleep warm, and the rest of you will navigate the spaces between them, trying not to stumble into conflicts you don't understand or violate rules you weren't taught. You fall into line for supper, and the man beside you, back to being silent now that he's spent his limited social energy, gives you one final piece of advice. Keep your head down. Don't make friends. Don't make enemies. Don't stand out. Invisible is safe. Memorable is dangerous. It's solid advice, the kind that might keep you alive in a place designed to grind you down. You watch Jenkins take his place in line, watch Thomas and the kitchen crew position themselves near the dining hall entrance, watch Collins hovering close to the master's assistant. The workhouse within the workhouse, the real system beneath the official one. And you understand now why silence is survival. Because speaking up means being noticed. Being noticed means becoming someone's target or tool. And in here, both options end badly. So you keep your mouth shut, your head down, and your growing knowledge of workhouse politics carefully locked behind an expression of careful neutrality. Just another grey figure in a grey line, unremarkable and forgettable, which is exactly how you plan to stay. The supper bell hasn't rung yet when the commotion starts near the main building. You're still in formation, waiting with the disciplined patience of people who've learned that moving without permission is asking for trouble, when 2 of the master's assistants emerge dragging someone between them. It's the young man from earlier, the one who approached Jenkins wrong, the one who clearly hasn't learned the unwritten rules yet. His face is panicked, and he's protesting loudly enough that everyone in the yard can hear him. I didn't take nothing. I swear it. I found it on the floor. I was going to return it. His voice cracks on the last word, desperation bleeding through. The assistants don't respond, just haul him toward the centre of the yard where a wooden post stands. You've seen it before, but never really thought about its purpose until now. Apparently you're about to get your education in workhouse discipline, whether you want one or not. Master Thornby emerges from his quarters looking irritated, like someone's interrupted his pre-supper drink. He's carrying something that glints in the fading afternoon light. A leather strap, maybe 2 feet long, the kind that looks innocent until you remember what it's used for. The mainstream historical fact is that corporal punishment was standard practice in 18th century workhouses, legally sanctioned and considered essential for maintaining order. Flogging, strapping, and confinement were all acceptable tools in the reformative arsenal, applied at the master's discretion with minimal oversight. Thomas Martin, Thornby announces, his voice carrying across the yard with practiced authority. Accused of theft, a piece of bread was found concealed in his jacket. Theft of workhouse property. The young man, Martin apparently, tries to protest again, but one of the assistants cuffs him across the back of the head hard enough to shut him up. You watch this happen with the growing sense that you're about to witness something that will either harden you further or break something inside you that still believes in fairness. They tie Martin's hands to the post, stretching his arms above his head so he's facing the wood, back exposed. His shirt is pulled up, revealing pale skin that's about to become significantly less pale. The yard is silent now except for Martin's ragged breathing and the distant sound of the women's wing where presumably something similar might be happening or has happened or will happen, because punishment is universal even if the victims change. Thornby tests the strap against his own palm once, twice, the leather making a sharp smack sound that promises worse to come. This establishment operates on trust, he begins, and you have to admire the audacity of using the word trust in a place where everyone's starving and desperate. When that trust is violated, correction is necessary. 6 strokes for theft. Martin, you will count them aloud. Here's your quirky tidbit that's about as fun as a root canal. Some workhouse masters kept detailed punishment logs, recording each offence and its corresponding discipline with the precision of accountants documenting business expenses. These records survive in archives, and historians pore over them, finding entries like 3 strokes for insolence, 5 strokes for feigned illness, and 12 strokes for attempting to escape. Someone's grandmother's suffering reduced to a line in a ledger. History is just depressing paperwork when you really think about it. The first stroke lands with a crack that makes you flinch. Martin screams, not words, just a raw sound of shock and pain, and forgets to count. The assistants remind him, not gently, that counting is mandatory. 1, he gasps, and you can see the red welt already rising across his back. Thornby waits. The spacing between strokes is part of the punishment, the anticipation as awful as the impact. The second stroke. 2, Martin's voice breaks, and there are tears now, visible even from where you're standing. You want to look away, but looking away feels like cowardice, like you're abandoning him to face this alone. So you watch, and you hate yourself for watching, and you hate the system that makes watching mandatory, and you hate the man with the strap who's performing his duties with the enthusiasm of someone beating a carpet. 3. The welt pattern on Martin's back is starting to look like some twisted form of tribal decoration, red lines crisscrossing pale flesh. His body jerks with each impact, involuntary spasms that pull against the ropes holding him to the post. You notice Jenkins watching with a carefully neutral expression, probably filing away the lesson that this is what happens when you don't follow the proper channels. 4. Martin's voice is barely audible now, more sob than word. Thornby adjusts his grip on the strap, and you realise with sick fascination that he's enjoying this. Not in an overtly sadistic way, nothing so honest, but in the subtle satisfaction of someone exercising power, demonstrating authority, proving that he matters in this small, miserable kingdom. Historians still argue whether workhouse discipline was genuinely intended to reform behaviour, or simply served as public theatre meant to terrify the rest of the inmate population into compliance. Watching Martin's back turn into raw meat while 60 men stand at attention bearing witness, you're pretty confident about which interpretation is correct. This isn't about reforming Martin. This is about reforming everyone who's watching Martin. 5. His voice cracks completely, dissolving into a wail that makes your skin crawl. You've heard pain before. You've experienced pain before. But there's something particularly awful about pain that's being inflicted deliberately, methodically, by someone who believes they're doing right. Thornby isn't angry. He's not even particularly invested. He's just doing his job, maintaining order, keeping the machine running smoothly. The final stroke lands with the same mechanical precision as the first. 6, Martin whispers, and it's over. The assistants untie him, and he collapses immediately, unable to support his own weight. They drag him upright, showing weakness isn't allowed even after you've been beaten, and march him toward the refractory cell, which is apparently where you go after public flogging to contemplate your sins in cold darkness without dinner. Thornby addresses the assembled inmates, holding up the strap like it's a holy relic. Let this serve as a reminder that theft will not be tolerated. The parish provides for you, meagre though that provision may be, and to steal from the workhouse is to steal from every man, woman and child here. We are a community, and communities require order. The irony of calling this a community while one member is being dragged bleeding towards solitary confinement is apparently lost on him. The strap disappears back into Thornby's coat, and he returns to his quarters, dinner awaiting him in comfortable warmth while Martin shivers in the refractory cell with a shredded back and nothing to eat. The assistants disperse. The show is over. The lesson has been taught. and you're all a little bit more broken than you were 15 minutes ago. The man beside you, your occasionally talkative neighbour, leans close enough to whisper, "That bread he supposedly stole? Planted by Jenkins. Martin refused to pay tribute, thought he could just exist here without playing the game. Jenkins made an example." The words settle in your stomach like stones. Not just punishment then, political punishment, a demonstration of what happens when you don't respect the hierarchy. The supper bell finally rings, and the formation moves toward the dining hall. You file past the post where Martin was tied, and you can see blood on the wood, dark stains that will stay there until rain washes them away. A warning to everyone who passes. This is what happens when you break the rules. This is what happens when you challenge the system. This is what happens when you're poor and powerless, and someone more powerful decides you need correction. You take your place in the dining hall and your appetite is gone. Not that the appetite for workhouse food was ever strong to begin with, but you'll eat anyway because not eating is its own form of punishment, and you've seen enough punishment for one day. Martin's empty seat at the table is a void that everyone studiously ignores. Invisible is safe, memorable is dangerous, and Martin just became the most memorable person in the workhouse, which means he's the least safe person here. You keep your head down, eat your bread, and pray to gods you don't believe in that you never give anyone a reason to tie you to that post. The supper arrives with the same graceless efficiency as every meal here. Wooden boards dropped in front of each person with a thunk that echoes off stone walls. Your portion materializes before you, and you assess it with the practiced eye of someone who's learned to inventory calories like a miser counting coins. Tonight it's bread again. Because of course it's bread. Bread is eternal in the workhouse, and beside it, a small wooden cup of something that might charitably be called broth. The bread is the same dense, dark stuff from midday, though this portion is smaller. Maybe 4 ounces instead of 6, which your stomach immediately registers as a betrayal. You pick it up and feel its weight, and there's a moment of absurd grief for the 2 missing ounces, as if those 2 ounces were the difference between satisfaction and starvation, which, mathematically speaking, they might be. You break the bread, it resists because workhouse bread always resists, and examine the interior. Same grey-brown density, same texture that suggests the baker's primary concern was creating something that wouldn't spoil before next week, rather than something humans might enjoy eating. There are small dark flecks throughout that could be bran, or could be mouse droppings, and you've learned not to investigate too closely, because some questions are better left unanswered. The mainstream historical fact that's currently ruining your appetite is that typical workhouse rations in the 1750s provided somewhere between 200 and 800 calories per day, depending on the institution and how generous the master felt. That might sound almost adequate until you remember that you've spent today picking oakum for 4 hours and breaking stones for 5, which burns somewhere around 2,500 to 3,000 calories. The math is simple. You're operating at a deficit of 700 to 1,800 calories per day. Your body is slowly consuming itself, burning muscle and fat to make up the difference, and eventually there won't be anything left to burn. You turn your attention to the broth. It's in a cup roughly the size of a gentleman's teacup, which is to say, laughably inadequate. The liquid inside is brownish and thin with a few sad bits of something floating in it. Vegetable scraps, maybe, or the memory of vegetables that passed through this kitchen at some point in history. You lift it to your nose and smell water, mainly. Hot water with aspirations of being soup. Water that once met a turnip or a carrot and decided to carry forward a faint impression of that encounter. You take a sip. It's warm, which is its primary virtue. The taste is so subtle as to be nearly theoretical. A whisper of vegetable, a hint of salt, a suggestion that somewhere, someone once cooked food in this pot and this water remembers. It goes down easily because there's nothing to resist going down, just hot liquid that momentarily tricks your stomach into thinking something nourishing is arriving. Here's your quirky, historical tidbit. Some progressive workhouses in the later 18th century started adding nutritious broths to evening meals, believing that liquids were easier for the digestive systems of malnourished people to process. The broths were made from vegetable scraps and occasionally bone trimmings from the master's kitchen, boiled for hours to extract every possible nutrient. What you're drinking right now is the pinnacle of this enlightened nutritional thinking. Wastewater with ambitions. Around you, 60 men perform the same joyless consumption. The dining hall is quieter than usual, the earlier flogging having dampened whatever small spirit existed here. People chew mechanically, staring at their boards or into middle distance, processing fuel rather than enjoying food. Martin's empty seat is a presence in its absence, and you can see people glancing at it, quickly looking away, probably running their own calculations about how long until they do something wrong and earn that seat's fate. You work through your bread slowly, trying to make it last, trying to trick your brain into thinking you're eating more than you are. Chew slowly, they say. Salivate more. Let each bite sit on your tongue. All the mental gymnastics of someone trying to stretch inadequate rations across impossible hunger. The bread scrapes down your throat dry despite the broth sips you take between bites, and settles in your stomach like ballast. Present but not satisfying. The broth is gone too quickly. You tip the cup back, drain every drop, even lick the rim to catch the few molecules of flavour that might be clinging there. Then you stare at the empty cup and contemplate the vast injustice of a world where some people have second helpings, and you have this empty cup and 4 ounces of bread between you and tomorrow morning's gruel. Historians still argue whether workhouse masters deliberately kept rations minimal to deter people from seeking poor relief, the less eligibility principle that said workhouse conditions should be worse than the worst independent labourer's life, or whether they simply couldn't afford more on limited parish budgets. But sitting here with your inadequate supper and your growling stomach, the motivation doesn't matter. The effect is the same. You're starving slowly, legally, systematically. You do the math because the math is inescapable. Breakfast, maybe 300 calories of gruel. Midday, perhaps 400 calories of bread and questionable cheese. Supper, roughly 350 calories of bread and vegetable-flavoured water. Total, 1,050 calories. You've burned at least 2,500 today. The deficit is 1,450 calories, which your body will extract from your reserves, except your reserves are nearly gone. You can feel it in your clothes, how they hang looser than when you arrived. You can see it in the mirror on the rare occasions you catch your reflection. How your face has become more angular, your eyes larger in your thinning face. The kitchen crew moves, through the hall collecting the boards and cups. Thomas passes your table, and you notice he's slipped an extra half piece of bread to one of his clients. The exchange so smooth you'd miss it if you weren't watching for it. The recipient palms the bread, tucks it into his shirt and continues chewing his official ration as if nothing happened. Extra calories, purchased through some favour or payment you can only guess at. In the workhouse economy, that half piece of bread is wealth. Your board disappears, your cup disappears, and with them goes supper. Your stomach sends up a formal complaint to your brain. Insufficient, inadequate, insulting. Your brain files the complaint in the same place it files all the other complaints, the rapidly filling cabinet labelled "Things You Can't Change," and prepares for the long hungry hours until breakfast. The man beside you stands and you follow suit, your leg wound protesting the movement. The gash from the stone fragment has settled into a steady throb, and you wonder distantly if it's infected or just angry. Probably both. You shuffle toward the exit with the others, a slow parade of inadequately fed bodies heading toward inadequately warm beds. Someone near the back vomits quietly into their cup before the servers can collect it. Too hungry to keep down even the minimal food, or perhaps just sick, though sickness and starvation are hard to distinguish when both produce the same result. The servers take the cup without comment, because this is apparently common enough to not warrant attention. You file out into the corridor, and the evening stretches ahead. 2 hours of carefully supervised recreation, then bedtime, then the whole miserable cycle starts again. Your stomach growls, a sound you've become so familiar with. It's like a companion, a faithful friend who never leaves and never brings good news. 4 ounces of bread and a cup of broth. This is supper. This is what the parish provides. This is what your labour has earned you. And tomorrow you'll do it all again, burning thousands of calories while consuming barely 1,000, slowly disappearing one meal at a time. At least the bread was fresh. By workhouse standards, fresh means baked within the last 3 days. By any other standards, it just means you're starving with slightly better bread than usual. After supper, during the brief period before evening chapel, you find yourself near the central corridor, where the workhouse's architectural philosophy becomes brutally clear. The building is divided like a prison, with separate wings radiating from the main administrative hub. Men's wing to the east, women's wing to the west, children's quarters to the north, and in the centre, the master's residence presiding over this kingdom of enforced separation like a spider in a web of human misery. You're not supposed to be here. The central corridor is technically off limits except during controlled movements, but you've learned that the 5 minutes between supper and chapel offers a slim window where the overseers are distracted and minor rule violations might go unnoticed. You stand near the junction point, pretending to adjust your shoe while actually looking down the women's wing corridor, trying to catch a glimpse of something, anything, that might confirm there are actual women in this building and not just the abstract concept of segregated female paupers. And then you see her, a woman, maybe 30, standing at the far end of the women's corridor near a window. She's looking toward the men's wing with an intensity that makes your chest hurt. Her lips are moving, and it takes you a moment to realize she's calling a name, over and over, soft enough that the matron won't hear, but loud enough that maybe, possibly, the person she's calling might. William. 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 A man's name. Her husband, probably, or her son, separated from her by 50 feet and an ideological commitment to breaking up families in order to save them. The mainstream historical fact that's currently breaking your heart is that the 1722 Poor Law explicitly required workhouses to maintain separate quarters for men, women and children, with married couples forcibly separated upon admission. The reasoning was that poverty bred immorality, that the poor lacked self-control, and that allowing men and women to mingle would result in illegitimate children who would become additional burdens on the parish. Better to tear families apart than risk the moral contamination of unsupervised contact between married couples who might, God forbid, want to be near each other. A young woman appears beside the first, younger, maybe 16, and starts calling too. "Papa! Papa, can you hear me?" Her voice cracks on the word, and you watch her press her face against the bars of the interior gate that separates the women's wing from the central corridor. She can't see into the men's wing from where she is, probably doesn't even know if her father is in this building or dead, or in a different workhouse entirely, but she calls anyway because what else can she do? An overseer appears at your elbow. You didn't hear him approach, which is concerning, and says flatly, "Move along." Not aggressive, just matter of fact, the way you'd tell a dog to stop sniffing something. You move, because not moving would invite questions and attention, and possibly a meeting with Thornby's leather strap. But as you shuffle toward the chapel corridor, you hear the woman still calling, "William, William." A prayer to a husband she can't see, can't touch, can't know is even alive. The chapel service provides another glimpse into the segregation system's architecture. The space is divided by a wooden partition running down the middle, men on one side, women on the other, with a small section at the back for children. You file into the men's side and take your assigned spot on a hard wooden pew, and you can hear them on the other side of the partition, coughing, shifting, breathing. Women who might be your wife, your sister, your mother, reduced to sounds through a wall. The partition has small gaps where the boards don't quite meet, and if you position yourself correctly, you can see slivers of the women's side. You do this now, angling your head like you're adjusting your posture for prayer, when really you're trying to see through a 1/4-inch crack into the forbidden zone. You catch glimpses, a grey dress, a pale hand, a woman's profile as she stares straight ahead with the blank expression you've come to recognise as present, but emotionally absent. Here's your quirky tidbit that might make you laugh if you weren't so depressed. Some workhouse couples developed elaborate systems for communicating across the segregation barriers. Coded messages in chapel hymns, signals through windows, notes hidden in laundry that was occasionally shared between wings. There are documented cases of couples maintaining entire relationships through stolen moments and creative rule-breaking, conducting their marriages in 5-second intervals over the course of years. Romance in the age of institutional poverty, somehow more tragic than the absence of romance entirely. The chaplain arrives, a thin man with the exhausted look of someone who's tired of preaching redemption to people whose primary sin is being poor, and begins the evening service. "Blessed are the poor in spirit," he intones, which is convenient because this building is absolutely packed with the poor in everything. The congregation responds with the required verses, voices echoing strangely because of the partition, men on one side and women on the other, together but separate, united in misery but divided by policy. Through your crack in the partition, you see a woman crying silently. Tears run down her face, but she makes no sound. her mouth moving in the required prayers while her eyes leak grief. You wonder what she's lost. Husband? Children? Both? The workhouse takes everything and gives back rules, structure, discipline, the firm guidance of people who've never been poor explaining to the poor how they should behave. A child in the back section starts crying, a real cry, the kind that children make when they're scared and alone and want their parents. You can hear the matron shushing them, not unkindly but firmly, reminding them that chapel is for prayer, not emotion. The crying continues for a moment, then stops abruptly, and you hope that means comfort rather than punishment. But in here, hope is usually disappointed. Historians still argue whether workhouse segregation was genuinely intended to promote moral reform and prevent vice, or whether it was primarily a cost control measure designed to prevent the birth of additional paupers who would require support. Either way, the effect is the same. Families are torn apart, children are separated from parents, married couples are forced to live as strangers, all under the guise of helping them escape poverty. It's like burning down a house to kill the spiders. Technically effective, but you've lost the house. The chaplain moves to a sermon about Job, which feels pointed. "The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away," he reads, which is one way to describe the economic forces and social policies that landed everyone in this room here. You suppose attributing everything to divine will is easier than admitting that poverty is a human-made problem with human-made solutions that primarily involve punishing the poor for being poor. Through the partition crack, you see an older woman, maybe 60, who's staring at the men's side with such desperate intensity that you know she's looking for someone specific. Her husband, probably, separated from her after decades of marriage because the workhouse believes that poverty and intimacy are incompatible. She searches the visible faces, her expression cycling through hope and disappointment and resignation, and you wonder if she's even in the right workhouse. If her husband is alive, if this desperate searching will ever end in reunion or just more separation. A man 2 rows ahead of you is doing the same thing, searching the women's side through gaps in the partition looking for someone. His wife, his daughter, his mother. Someone who matters enough that he's risking an overseer noticing his wandering attention. He finds her. You see the moment of recognition, the way his whole body shifts. And for 3 seconds they look at each other through the gap. No words, no touch, just looking. Then an overseer on the women's side shifts position. The gap is blocked, and the connection is severed. The service continues its dreary march through prayers and hymns and scriptural readings about suffering and endurance, and how the meek will inherit the earth, which is small comfort when you're currently not even being allowed to inherit time with your own family. The partition stands between you and the women, solid and impassable, a physical manifestation of the ideology that believes separating families will somehow strengthen them. You hear a name being called from the women's side so soft you almost miss it under the hymn. John, John, I'm here. And on the men's side, someone, John presumably, shifts position trying to locate the voice, trying to send back some signal that he heard, that he's still here, that they haven't been completely erased from each other's lives. This is what passes for family contact in the workhouse. Stolen words under hymns, glimpses through partition gaps, the desperate hope that someone you love is still breathing somewhere in this building. The chaplain concludes with a benediction about God's mercy, which is rich coming from an institution that separates mothers from children and husbands from wives, while claiming to provide charitable relief. The congregation stands, files out in segregated lines, men to their wing, women to theirs, children to their quarters, and the architecture enforces what policy demands: isolation, separation, the systematic prevention of human connection. As you shuffle back toward the men's wing, you pass the central corridor again, and the woman is still there, still calling, William. She'll probably call until the matron forces her away, and William, wherever he is, whoever he is, probably can't even hear her. But she calls anyway, because love in the workhouse is an act of rebellion, a refusal to let the system erase the connections that make you human. The Victorian solution to family poverty: destroy the family, separate everyone, remove all sources of comfort and connection, then wonder why people would rather starve in the streets than accept this kind of help. At least in prison, criminals get visiting hours. After chapel, you find yourself on cleaning duty, a rotating assignment that's somehow both tedious and enlightening. which tonight means scrubbing the corridor outside the master's apartments. This is the closest you've gotten to Thornby's private quarters, and the contrast between his world and yours is so stark it would be funny if it weren't so enraging. The corridor here is different. The stone isn't bare and damp like the rest of the workhouse. It's been covered with wooden wainscoting, actual decorative panels that keep the cold at bay and suggest someone cares about aesthetics. There's a carpet runner, worn but still functional, providing insulation that your dormitory could only dream of. Gas lamps, actual gas lamps, not the tallow candles that light the inmates' areas, provide steady, clean light that doesn't flicker or smoke or require constant attention. You're on your knees with a brush and bucket, scrubbing floors that are already cleaner than anything in the men's wing will ever be, when the door to the master's apartment opens. Warmth billows out like a physical presence, and you catch a glimpse inside. A sitting room with actual furniture, upholstered chairs, a side table, curtains on the windows, and most incredibly a fire. Not a small rationed fire like the single stove that allegedly heats your dormitory of 60 men. A proper roaring fire that's being used to warm maybe 3 people. Mrs. Thornby emerges, the master's wife, dressed in clothes that cost more than the annual food budget for half the inmates. She glances at you the way someone might glance at a piece of furniture, acknowledging your existence without really seeing you, and sweeps past toward the dining area. Through the open door you smell food. Real food. Roasted meat, baked bread that isn't dense enough to use as a weapon, something sweet that might be pie. Your stomach, which thought it had finished complaining for the evening, files a new grievance. The mainstream historical fact that's currently making you want to commit violence against inanimate objects is that workhouse masters in the 18th century were typically paid through a combination of salary and perquisites. Essentially, they got to keep the difference between their parish allowance for feeding inmates and what they actually spent. The more cheaply they fed you, the more they personally profited. Thornby's comfortable apartment, his wife's fine dress, that roasted meat you're smelling, all funded by the gap between what the parish provides and the minimal gruel you actually receive. A servant emerges from the apartment. Yes, a servant. Because apparently the master of a poorhouse requires personal staff carrying a tray of dishes. She's not an inmate. She's hired help, probably a local girl paid actual wages to work in comfort, rather than assigned here by poverty. She sees you scrubbing and offers a sympathetic smile that somehow makes it worse. Pity from someone who gets to leave at the end of the day and go home to a house that isn't a warehouse for human desperation. You continue scrubbing, and through the open door you can hear conversation. Thornby is discussing the workhouse accounts with his wife, and their tone is the same tone you'd use discussing any business venture. The oakum sales were good this quarter, you hear him say, and we've reduced the bread expenditure by switching suppliers. Reduced the bread expenditure. That explains why your dinner portion has been shrinking. Not budgetary constraints. Profit optimization. Your empty stomach is their increased margin. Here's your quirky historical tidbit that'll really warm your cockles. Some workhouse masters became quite wealthy through their positions. There are records of masters living in substantial comfort, sending their children to good schools, retiring with property and savings, all while the people in their charge subsisted on the legal minimum. The position was actually sought after in some parishes, a respectable job with steady income and opportunities for economies of scale. You're not just poor, you're a revenue stream. The matron appears, Mrs. Thornby's counterpart who manages the women's wing, and the 2 women confer in low voices about staffing issues. The new girl in the kitchen is too soft, the matron says, giving extra portions to the children. I've had to correct her twice. The master's wife nods sympathetically. It's always difficult when they don't understand that charity requires discipline. They're discussing literally starving children with the same tone you'd use debating curtain colours. You scrub harder, channeling your rage into the bristles and the stone, making the floor cleaner than it has any right to be. Through another door you catch a glimpse of what must be the master's private dining room. A table set with china. Actual china, not wooden bowls, and cutlery that gleams silver in the firelight. Places set for 2, waiting for the dinner you smelled earlier. They'll eat roasted meat while 60 men digest 4 ounces of bread. They'll sleep in a warm room while you shiver in a dormitory that's barely above freezing. This is the machinery of poverty relief. Grind the poor down, skim the profits, call it moral improvement. Historians still argue whether the workhouse master system was corrupted by greedy individuals or was fundamentally designed to prioritise cost savings over humane treatment. Watching Thornby emerge from his warm apartment, belly full of roasted meat, to inspect your floor scrubbing technique, you're pretty confident about which interpretation makes more sense. The system isn't broken. It's working exactly as designed. It's just designed to benefit everyone except the people it's supposedly helping. Adequate, Thornby says, glancing at your work. Not good, not excellent, adequate. The highest praise you'll receive for making his corridor shinier than your entire dormitory. He returns to his apartment, and the door closes, and the warmth and light and smell of real food are sealed away behind wood and privilege, and the comfortable certainty that his position is ordained by God and social necessity. You finish scrubbing, dump your dirty water in the yard pump, and return to the men's wing. The contrast is immediate and brutal, from carpeted warmth to bare stone cold, from gas lamps to sputtering tallow, from the smell of roasted meat to the smell of 60 unwashed men in inadequate ventilation. This is your world. Thornby's world is 50 feet away, but might as well be on another planet. The man beside you in the dormitory, your occasionally talkative neighbour, sees your expression and understands without asking. First time seeing the master's quarters? You nod. He chuckles bitterly. Yeah, that's when you really understand the system. We're not here to be helped. We're here to be processed. And the people processing us get paid by the pound, so to speak. The less they spend on us, the more they keep. Simple economics. Simple economics. Your hunger is his profit margin. Your suffering is his retirement fund. Your labour produces goods sold for actual money that funds his comfortable life, while you subsist on calculated minimum rations. It's efficient, really. Morally obscene, but efficient. You lie down on your straw mattress, pulling your thin blanket over yourself, and think about roasted meat and warm fires and china plates. Somewhere in this building, Thornby's probably finishing dessert. Something with cream, something sweet, something that costs more than your weekly food ration. The workhouse master, a position of trust, authority, and civic responsibility. Also a position where you can profit from human misery while calling it charitable work and sleeping soundly in a warm bed. At least the floor outside his apartment is very clean now. You did good work there. Adequate work, according to the man eating your dinner portions. After your floor scrubbing duties, you're herded with the others toward what the workhouse schedule optimistically calls recreation period. The word recreation suggests fun, leisure, activities chosen freely for enjoyment. What you're about to experience is technically none of those things, but someone in the administration has decided that calling it mandatory supervised sitting time lacks the proper reformative ring. The day room is a rectangular space on the ground floor, maybe 30 feet by 20, with benches arranged along the walls like a waiting room for an appointment with boredom. The mainstream historical fact is that by the 1750s, progressive reformers insisted workhouses provide some form of leisure time, arguing that constant labour without rest was cruel and counterproductive. What they got was this: 45 minutes of sitting in a cold room under observation, where the primary activity is not working, and the secondary activity is being reminded that even your rest is controlled. You file in with the others and take a spot on a bench. The wood is hard, worn smooth by decades of restless shifting, and there's no back support because comfort might suggest that your leisure time is actually meant to be leisurely. Around you, men arrange themselves in careful spacing, not too close, which might suggest conspiracy, but not too far apart, which might suggest antisocial tendencies. Everything in the workhouse is calibrated, measured, observed. An overseer stations himself near the door, arms crossed, watching. Not actively threatening, just present. A reminder that even this break from labour is a privilege that can be revoked. The rules for recreation period are unwritten but universally understood. Sit quietly, speak in low voices if at all. No gambling, no games, no singing, no laughter that sounds too genuine. Essentially, recreate in a manner that suggests you're not actually enjoying recreation. The room itself is decorated with the workhouse's signature aesthetic of deliberately depressing. Bare walls, high windows that let in minimal light, a single stove in the corner that's putting out approximately enough heat to warm a teacup. There's a table in the centre with a Bible on it, the only reading material provided, which you suppose counts as entertainment, if your definition of entertainment is loose enough to include scripture about suffering and endurance. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some workhouses provided improving materials during recreation periods, religious tracts, moral tales, books about the virtues of hard work and the dangers of idleness. The theory was that inmates would use their leisure time to educate themselves toward better character. In practice, most people were too exhausted from actual labour to focus on reading about the importance of labour, and the materials largely went unused except as fire kindling, which was probably the most practical use anyone found for them. You sit. This is the this activity. Sitting. You've been sitting all morning picking oakum, and standing all afternoon breaking stones, and now you're sitting again, which should feel like rest but somehow doesn't. Your body is exhausted but not relaxed, tense with the constant vigilance that workhouse life requires. You can't truly rest when you're being watched, when any moment of genuine ease might be interpreted as laziness or defiance. The man beside you, your neighbour, now a recurring character in your daily misery, pulls out a small piece of wood and a fragment of broken glass. He begins scratching at the wood, carving something with painful slowness. This is apparently an approved recreation activity, whittling with improvised tools while producing nothing useful. The overseer doesn't intervene, so this must fall within acceptable bounds of not working. Across the room, two men are engaged in what might be conversation. Their voices so low you can't make out words. They're not looking at each other. Direct eye contact might suggest they're actually communicating rather than just accidentally speaking near each other, and their body language screams, "Please don't notice us." The overseer does notice, watches them for a moment, decides they're not plotting anything interesting, and returns his attention to general surveillance. A younger man near the stove is staring into space with that 1,000-yard gaze you've become familiar with. He's not sleeping. Sleeping during recreation period is discouraged because it suggests you might be sick, which opens a whole administrative nightmare, but he's not conscious in any meaningful way either. He's retreated into whatever mental space people retreat to when external reality becomes unbearable. You've started developing your own version of this, a place in your head where the workhouse doesn't exist and your life is something other than this. Historians still argue whether workhouse recreation periods were genuinely intended to provide mental restoration and prevent breakdown, or were simply mandated breaks to avoid the legal complications of working inmates literally to death. Either way, the execution is the same. You're not working, but you're also not resting, existing instead in this liminal space where leisure has been stripped of everything that makes it leisurely. Someone near the back coughs, a deep rattling sound that makes everyone tense. Sickness is contagious, and nobody wants to be near someone who might be developing consumption or typhus, or whatever plague is currently making rounds. The coughing man notices the social distancing happening around him and moves to a different bench, isolating himself voluntarily. Smart move. Being identified as sick means the infirmary, and the infirmary is where you go to discover that death might be preferable to workhouse healthcare. The Bible sits on the central table, untouched. You suppose you could read it. Technically, that's an allowed activity, but the effort of standing, walking to the table, opening the book, and maintaining focus on scripture seems beyond your current energy reserves. Everything requires energy you don't have. Conversation, reading, thinking, even the basic act of being present in your own body. The caloric deficit you're running means every action is budgeted, and recreation doesn't seem worth the expenditure. A man stands, walks to the door, presumably to use the privy. The overseer watches him go, makes a mental note of the absence, will probably track how long he's gone because even urination is monitored in places like this. The man returns 3 minutes later, and you can see him calculating whether the break was worth the scrutiny. Probably not, but nature makes demands that workhouse rules can't fully control. Your neighbour finishes his carving. It's a small wooden figure, maybe 3 inches tall, crudely shaped but recognisably human. He looks at it for a moment with something approaching satisfaction, then tucks it into his pocket. This is what passes for accomplishment in recreation period, making a small thing out of scraps with broken glass, creating something that serves no purpose but exists as evidence that you're still capable of creation. You wonder if he'll trade it for extra rations or keep it as a reminder that he once had the energy to make something. The 45 minutes crawl past like geological time. No clock in the room. Clocks would suggest your time matters enough to measure, but you can feel the minutes accumulating, each one slightly heavier than the last. Recreation period isn't restful, it's just differently exhausting. Instead of physical labour, it's the exhaustion of enforced idleness, of sitting still while being watched, of existing in a space where even leisure is a form of control. Finally, eternally, the overseer announces that recreation period is concluded. You stand with the others, feeling somehow more tired than when you sat down. The brief not working has reminded your body of everything that hurts, every injury and ache that constant labour helps you ignore. Your leg wound throbs, your shoulders protest. Your hands, still damaged from oakum and stones, send up complaints that you file away with all the others. You file toward the dormitory for the evening's final ritual, preparing for bed in a room with 60 strangers, trying to find rest in a place designed to prevent it. Recreation is over. Now comes the even more challenging task of actually recreating your energy for tomorrow's identical misery. At least you didn't have to read the Bible. Small mercies. The evening bell summons you to chapel for the second time today, because apparently one dose of spiritual improvement per day is insufficient when you're poor. You file into the men's side of the divided chapel with the resignation of someone attending a lecture on their own moral inadequacy, which is essentially what Workhouse chapel services are. The partition stands between you and the women, solid and unforgiving, a physical manifestation of the theological principle that poverty and human connection are incompatible. The chaplain tonight is different from the morning service. This one is Reverend Blackwell, the parish vicar who makes weekly visits to remind everyone that their circumstances are probably their own fault. He's a round man with well-fed cheeks and clothes that speak of comfortable income, standing before a congregation of people who've forgotten what comfortable feels like. The irony of a wealthy man lecturing the poor on the virtues of suffering is apparently lost on him, though it's not lost on you. "Let us pray," Blackwell begins, and 60 heads bow obediently because not bowing would be noticed and noted and possibly punished. His prayer is long and elaborate, thanking God for the workhouse system, for the charitable parish, for the opportunity, for the poor to receive guidance and correction. You're being corrected right now, apparently. Your poverty isn't bad luck or economic forces beyond your control. It's a moral failing that requires divine intervention and institutional management. The mainstream historical fact that's currently testing your ability to maintain a neutral expression is that 18th century Anglican theology heavily emphasized the connection between poverty and sin. The prevailing view, preached from pulpits across England, was that the social order was divinely ordained. The rich were blessed by God for their virtue. The poor were suffering consequences of their vice. If you were poor, you'd probably done something wrong. Maybe your parents had done something wrong. Maybe you were lazy or drank too much or lacked the moral fibre to succeed. The system was working correctly. You were the malfunction. Blackwell moves into his sermon proper, opening with Proverbs, "The hand of the diligent shall bear rule, but the slothful shall be under tribute." His emphasis on slothful is unmistakable, and you feel it land on the congregation like an accusation. Never mind that you've spent today picking oakum until your fingers bled and breaking stones until your shoulders screamed. You're here because you're slothful, obviously. If you just worked harder in your previous life, you wouldn't be in this situation. The poor, Blackwell continues, warming to his theme, are given the gift of adversity to refine their character. Suffering is God's classroom, poverty, his teacher. Those who accept their circumstances with humility and gratitude will be elevated in the next life, while those who complain and resist their correction risk eternal damnation. So your options are, accept starvation gratefully, and maybe get rewarded after you're dead, or complain about starvation and definitely get punished forever. These seem like excellent options, really well designed to help people. Here's your quirky historical tidbit that might make you want to set something on fire. Workhouse chaplains were often paid by the parish based on attendance and moral improvement metrics. They had financial incentive to preach sermons that justified the workhouse system and discouraged complaint, because criticism of the workhouse was criticism of the parish authorities who controlled their salaries. So you're getting theology specifically designed to make you feel bad about being poor, while making the people who keep you poor feel good about themselves. It's efficient, really, in a completely evil way. Through the partition, you can hear a woman crying softly during the sermon. Not dramatic crying, just quiet tears that she's trying to hide. Blackwell either doesn't hear or doesn't care, continuing his lecture on how suffering is character building and poverty is probably deserved. Consider Job, he says, because of course he does. He accepted his suffering without complaint, trusted in God's plan, and was eventually restored. Never mind that Job was explicitly described as blameless, and his suffering was literally a bet between God and Satan. The Workhouse version is, "You're suffering because you deserve it, so shut up and be grateful." The sermon turns to the parable of the talents. You knew this was coming, where Blackwell interprets the story to mean that poor people are poor because they failed to multiply their resources through hard work and wise investment. The lazy servant who buried his talent was cast into outer darkness, Blackwell intones. So too will those who fail to improve themselves through labour and discipline. The fact that you've been labouring for 12 hours today on 150 calories apparently doesn't count. You should have laboured harder, worked smarter, pulled yourself up by bootstraps you can't afford. Historians still argue whether Workhouse religious instruction genuinely aimed to provide spiritual comfort and moral guidance, or primarily served to legitimate the social order and discourage resistance. Listening to Blackwell explain how your poverty is your fault while he stands in clothes worth more than your annual food budget, you're developing strong opinions on this debate. The Workhouse, Blackwell continues, is an instrument of God's mercy. It provides for those who cannot provide for themselves, offers structure to those who lack discipline, and gives the indigent opportunity to redeem themselves through honest labour. Honest labour. You've picked oakum and broken stones and scrubbed floors, and you're still hungry, still cold, still separated from any family you might have, still trapped in a system that grinds you down while calling it redemption. But sure, it's mercy. Divine mercy delivered through stale bread and systematic dehumanization. A man 3 rows ahead is asleep, head nodding forward despite the hard pew and the risk of punishment. The overseer notices but doesn't intervene immediately, possibly because the man's exhaustion is so complete that it's obvious he's not being deliberately disrespectful. He's just so tired that even Blackwell's lecture on moral inadequacy can't keep him conscious. Eventually the overseer prods him awake, and the man jerks upright, confused, and probably about to be assigned extra labour for sleeping during religious instruction. The sermon winds toward its conclusion with Blackwell's favourite theme, gratitude. You should thank God daily for the parish's charity, for the Workhouse's provision, for the opportunity to redeem yourselves through labour and reformation. Thank God for starvation rations. Thank God for family separation. Thank God for oakum picking until your fingers bleed. Thank God for a system that treats poverty as criminal behaviour requiring correction. The gratitude you're feeling right now is overwhelming, truly. And remember, Blackwell says, that your current suffering is temporary if you accept it with proper humility, but your eternal fate depends on your attitude toward this earthly trial. Complaint is ingratitude, and ingratitude is sin. So complaining about being systematically starved is a sin that might send you to hell. Good to know. The threat of eternal damnation as a tool for maintaining institutional order, it's almost impressive in its efficiency. The service concludes with a hymn, All Things Bright and Beautiful, which includes the verse, The rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate, God made them high and lowly and ordered their estate. You're singing about how God specifically designed social inequality, and you should accept your position in the divinely ordained hierarchy. The rich man gets a castle, you get a workhouse, and this is all part of God's perfect plan. The women on the other side of the partition are singing the same words, their voices thin and tired, accepting through song that their poverty is ordained by heaven. Blackwell offers a final benediction, blessing the workhouse, the master, the parish authorities, and finally, almost as an afterthought, the inmates themselves. May you find peace in acceptance and redemption through labour, he concludes. Peace through acceptance, redemption through labour, not food through adequate rations or comfort through human treatment, but peace and redemption through shutting up and working until you die. The congregation rises and you file out toward the dormitories. Your soul has been improved, apparently. Your character has been refined. You've been reminded that your poverty is your fault and your suffering is deserved, and your only hope is grateful acceptance of a system designed to break you. Behind you, Blackwell is probably heading home to a warm house and a good dinner, secure in the knowledge that he's done God's work today. He's explained to the poor that they deserve to be poor, to the hungry that they deserve to be hungry, to the desperate that their desperation is a divine teaching moment. And somewhere, God is either laughing or weeping. You're not sure which. Would be worse. The chapel empties and you shuffle back toward the men's dormitory with the others, a tired procession of people whose souls have been improved but whose bodies remain stubbornly hungry and cold. The corridors are darker now. The workhouse economizes on evening lighting because why waste tallow on people who should be sleeping? And you navigate by memory and the dim glow of widely spaced candles that create more shadows than illumination. The dormitory door opens and you're hit with the smell. It's become so familiar that you barely register it anymore. But tonight, returning from the relatively aired chapel, it strikes you fresh. 60 men in inadequate ventilation, producing a concentrated essence of unwashed humanity that would make a lesser person gag. You don't gag. You've evolved beyond gagging. You just breathe through your mouth and accept that this is what air smells like in your world. The beds are arranged in tight rows, maybe 18 inches between each frame, close enough that you could reach out and touch your neighbours on either side without extending your arms fully. The mainstream historical fact is that workhouse dormitories typically allocated between 18 and 24 inches per person, which was actually considered generous compared to some lodging houses where people slept in shifts or packed 3 to a bed. The workhouse gives you your own bed frame and your own narrow slice of space, and this counts as luxury in the economy of institutional poverty. You make your way to your assigned bed, 3rd row, 7th position, navigating between the frames while men strip down to their undergarments, or in some cases just lie down fully clothed because undressing requires energy and optimism. Your bed is exactly as you left it this morning. Straw mattress compressed to near plank consistency, single thin blanket that's probably older than you are, and a small space that's technically yours but feels like it belongs to the workhouse more than it belongs to you. Privacy is a joke here. Actually calling it a joke suggests it's funny rather than just depressing. You have no privacy, none. When you undress, 60 men could watch if they cared enough to look. When you sleep, they hear every sound you make, every cough, every fart, every nightmare-induced whimper. When you wake, they're immediately aware because your movement disturbs the delicate ecosystem of shared misery. Personal space is measured in inches, and personal privacy is measured in none. You sit on your bed frame, the straw crackles beneath you like it's complaining about being compressed again, and remove your shoes. Your feet smell impressive, and not in a good way. The combination of work sweat, inadequate washing, and shoes that trap moisture has created a biological experiment that you're too tired to address properly. You'll splash them at the morning pump maybe, or just accept that feet in workhouses smell like defeat and move on with your life. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some workhouses implemented bed inspections, where overseers would check under mattresses and in bedding for contraband, stolen food, or personal items that exceeded the allowed minimum. There are records of inmates being punished for possessing extra clothing, letters from family members, or small personal mementos. You're allowed to exist in the workhouse, but not to have anything that suggests you once had a life outside it. The message is clear. You're an inmate, not a person, and personal possessions suggest personhood. The man in the next bed, your constant neighbour, the one who occasionally speaks, is already lying down, fully clothed, staring at the ceiling with the blank expression of someone whose thoughts have gone somewhere safer than here. You wonder where he goes in his head, what memories or fantasies he retreats to when reality becomes unbearable. You're developing your own mental escape routes, places where the workhouse doesn't exist and your life includes things like sufficient food and the absence of oakum. Across the dormitory, an argument is brewing. 2 men, voices rising despite the rule against evening noise, disputing something about blanket theft or bed position, or one of the 1,000 petty conflicts that arise when desperate people are packed too closely together. An overseer appears, they're always nearby, always watching, and the argument dies immediately. Both men lie down, faces turned away from each other, conflict unresolved but at least silent. Violence would mean serious punishment, so aggression gets swallowed, stored away, added to the accumulated resentment that everyone carries. You remove your shirt, it's filthy, but so is everything else, and you've learned not to be precious about cleanliness in a place that considers cold water and occasional soap the height of hygiene. Your torso is visible in the dim light, and you notice you're thinner than you were. Ribs more prominent, muscles less defined. The physical evidence of caloric deficit written on your body like a ledger of insufficient meals. You're disappearing slowly, one inadequate ration at a time, and your body is the accounting system recording the loss. The blanket goes over you, thin, scratchy wool that provides minimal warmth, but at least creates a psychological barrier between you and the room. Historians still argue whether workhouse bedding was deliberately inadequate to encourage inmates to leave quickly or simply reflected budget constraints. But either way, you're cold. The dormitory temperature is maybe 50 degrees, and your blanket is fighting a losing battle against basic thermodynamics. Around you, 60 men settle into their beds with the sounds of mass bedtime, creaking frames, rustling straw, coughing, throat clearing, the occasional groan as someone discovers a new way their body hurts. Someone's already snoring. That fast transition from conscious to unconscious that comes from total exhaustion. Someone else is crying quietly, face turned to the wall, trying to muffle the sound because emotional displays are discouraged but sometimes unavoidable. The overseer makes a final circuit, checking that everyone's in their assigned bed, that no one's plotting anything interesting, that the machinery of institutional sleep is functioning properly. He pauses near your section, and you keep your eyes closed, pretending you're already drifting off. He moves on. The candles are extinguished one by one, and darkness settles over the dormitory like a blanket that's actually warm, which your actual blanket isn't. You lie in the dark, 18 inches from strangers on either side, and try to find a position where your body hurts slightly less. Your leg wound throbs. Your shoulders ache. Your stomach is making plaintive requests for food that won't be answered until morning gruel. This is your life now, lying in the dark in a room full of desperate men, trying to rest enough to do it all again tomorrow. The man to your left shifts, and his movement rocks your bed frame slightly. The frames are old, unsteady, and everything is connected in this space where separation is theoretical but contact is constant. You shift in response, and the man to your right adjusts, and it's like dominoes, each movement causing reactions down the line. Privacy would mean your movements were your own. In the workhouse, even sleep is communal. Somewhere in the darkness, someone whispers a prayer. You can't make out the words, just the desperate rhythm of someone appealing to powers they hope are listening. You don't pray. You're not sure who you'd pray to or what you'd ask for. Food? Freedom? The strength to survive another day? All of the above? Prayer seems like it requires hope, and hope is expensive here. The dormitory settles into an uneasy quiet, punctuated by snoring, coughing, the occasional cry from someone lost in nightmares. This is bedtime in the workhouse, lying in the dark with 60 strangers, separated by inches, united by poverty, trying to find rest in a place designed to prevent it. Tomorrow the bell will ring at 5 a.m, and this will all begin again. The oakum, the stones, the gruel, the institutional machinery grinding another day out of your life. But for now, in the darkness, you can pretend you're somewhere else. You can pretend a lot of things when the lights are out and no one can see your face. Sleep doesn't come. You lie in the darkness with your eyes closed, performing the theatre of rest while your brain refuses to cooperate. Exhaustion should mean immediate unconsciousness. You've burned thousands of calories, injured yourself multiple times, and experienced more psychological stress than any human should tolerate in a day. But sleep operates on its own logic, and tonight that logic says you're going to lie here and think about everything you'd rather not think about. The darkness is thick, almost tangible, broken only by the faint glow from the corridor where a single candle burns for emergencies. Your eyes adjust slowly, and you can make out shapes. Bed frames stretching in rows, lumps of blanket-covered bodies, the occasional movement as someone shifts position. 60 men arranged like products in a warehouse, which is essentially what you are. Human inventory, catalogued and stored until morning when you'll be retrieved for labour. The sounds are what get you. In daylight, with activity and distraction, you can almost ignore how many people you're packed in with. But at night, in the quiet, every sound amplifies. The man to your right is snoring with the enthusiasm of someone whose unconscious has given up caring about social niceties. It's not gentle snoring. It's the kind that rattles and wheezes, suggesting respiratory problems that probably come from breathing stone dust or hemp fibre, or just the general atmosphere of institutional decay. 2 rows over, someone's coughing, deep wet coughs that speak of something seriously wrong in the lungs. Each cough is followed by a pause where the person tries to suppress the next one, fails, and produces another rattling hack that makes everyone else tense because consumption is contagious and nobody wants to be the next one in the sick ward. The mainstream historical fact is that diseases like tuberculosis, typhus, and dysentery spread rapidly in crowded workhouse dormitories, with mortality rates significantly higher than the general population. You're sleeping in a petri dish of potential plague, and there's nothing you can do about it except hope your immune system is working overtime. Someone near the back is crying. Not loud crying, that would bring the overseer, but quiet, desperate weeping that suggests someone's reached their breaking point. You've heard this sound before, multiple nights, sometimes from different people, sometimes from the same ones. The workhouse breaks people at different rates, but it breaks everyone eventually. Tonight it's that man's turn. Tomorrow it might be yours. Here's your quirky tidbit that's more horrifying than quirky. Workhouse records sometimes note night disturbances in their logs. Inmates who screamed in their sleep, who fought invisible enemies, who woke the dormitory with nightmares so vivid they couldn't distinguish them from reality. The treatment for night disturbances was typically punishment, because the workhouse viewed psychological breakdown as a discipline problem rather than a mental health crisis. Trauma isn't real if you punish people for having it, apparently. You shift position, trying to find some arrangement of body and blanket that doesn't highlight a specific pain. Your leg wound pulses with each heartbeat. Your shoulders are locked into a spasm from stone breaking. Your hands throb where oakum has shredded the skin. Even lying still hurts, which seems unfair. Rest should mean relief, but in the workhouse, nothing means relief. Pain is constant. Only its location and intensity vary. The straw mattress beneath you has compressed into something approaching concrete. You can feel the wooden slats through it, pressing into your back, your hips, your shoulders. You try to adjust to find a softer spot, but the mattress has been compressed by months or years of use, and soft spots don't exist anymore. This is what you sleep on. Thin layer of defeated straw between you and wood, wrapped in a blanket that's fighting a losing battle against December in England. Your mind wanders, and you think about how you ended up here. The specific chain of events that led from your previous life. Whatever that was, it's getting harder to remember clearly, to this dormitory, this bed, this moment of lying awake in the dark, wondering if you'll survive another day. Historians still argue whether workhouse populations were primarily the deserving poor, widows, orphans, disabled people, versus the undeserving poor, lazy, drunk, morally deficient. But lying here, you know the truth. There's no deserving or undeserving, there's just broke. You lost your job, or maybe your family died, or your farm failed, or you got injured, or the economy shifted, or any of the 1,000 ways that poverty happens to people who didn't plan for it, because nobody plans to be poor. And once you're poor, once you can't pay rent or buy food, once you've exhausted the charity of friends and family and strangers, you end up here. At the parish's door, asking for help, getting this instead. The workhouse. Society's answer to the question, what do we do with people who can't support themselves? Answer, make their lives so miserable they'll do anything to leave, even if leaving means starving in the streets. A scream pierces the darkness, short, sharp, quickly muffled as the person wakes and realizes where they are. Nightmare. Someone reliving whatever trauma brought them here, or creating new trauma from what they're experiencing here, or both. The overseer's footsteps approach, heavy and deliberate. The screaming stops immediately. The overseer stands there for a moment, listening, then retreats. The message is clear. Nightmares are allowed only if they're silent. You think about time. How long you've been here? Months, though the days blur together into an indistinguishable mass of gruel and labour and institutional regulation. How long you might be here? Indefinitely, unless something changes, unless you find work outside, unless you die, unless the system decides you've been sufficiently reformed. How time itself feels different here, each day identical to the last, creating a kind of temporal prison where past and future collapse into an eternal present of suffering. The snoring continues, the coughing continues, the crying has stopped, or moved to a register too quiet to hear. Someone near the window, there's a small window, barred and shuttered, barely visible in the darkness, is praying audibly, "Our Father, who art in heaven." The words drift through the dormitory and you wonder if anyone's listening. God, if he exists, probably has better things to do than monitor workhouse dormitories, though if he is listening, he's got a lot to answer for regarding this whole system. Your stomach growls, loud enough that you worry the man next to you can hear it. Hungry, still hungry, always hungry. The 4 ounces of bread from supper were 6 hours ago, and your body has processed them and found them wanting, and is now filing formal complaints. You won't eat again for 11 more hours, when the morning gruel arrives. 11 hours of lying here, working, standing at roll call, all on an empty stomach that's been empty for so long it's forgotten what full feels like. You wonder if you'll dream when sleep finally comes, whether your dreams will be about food, they usually are, or about your life before this, or about nothing at all. Whether you'll wake screaming like that man did, or whether you'll wake to the bell at 5 a.m. feeling like you never slept at all, which is the more common outcome. The dormitory settles into its night rhythm, snoring, coughing, shifting, breathing. 60 men in various states of wakefulness, each alone with their thoughts despite being surrounded by bodies. The workhouse has perfected isolation in proximity, has created a system where you can be touching distance from 60 people and still feel utterly alone. You close your eyes again, try to slow your breathing, attempt to trick your body into sleep through sheer force of will. It doesn't work. It never works. But you try anyway, because the alternative is lying here fully conscious, fully aware, thinking about tomorrow and all the tomorrows after that, stretching into an indefinite future of oakum and stones and gruel and institutional control. Somewhere in the darkness, someone whispers, "I can't do this anymore." You don't know who said it. It could be anyone. It could be everyone. It could be you, though you don't remember speaking. The night grinds on, measured in heartbeats and breath, and the slow passage of hours that feel like years. Sleep will come eventually. It has to, because the human body can't sustain indefinite consciousness. But for now, you lie awake in the dark with 60 strangers who feel less like company and more like witnesses to your ongoing dissolution. This is night in the workhouse. Darkness and sound and hunger and the growing certainty that tomorrow will be exactly like today, and the day after that, and the day after that until something breaks or you do. Sleep comes finally, not peacefully, but from sheer exhaustion, your body overriding your brain's protests and dragging you into unconsciousness sometime in the hours before dawn. Your dreams are fragmented, nonsensical, images of rope and stones and endless corridors, mixed with memories of life before this that feel more like stories about someone else than experiences you actually had. You're picking oakum in a field of bread, breaking stones that bleed, running through hallways that all lead back to the same dormitory. Dream logic, where everything makes perfect sense while making no sense at all. You don't know what time it is when you surface briefly, half awake, caught in that liminal space between sleep and consciousness. The dormitory is quieter now, the snoring softer, the coughing less frequent. This is the deepest part of the night, the hours between midnight and dawn when even misery takes a brief rest. You're aware of your body, the cold, the hunger, the aches, but distantly, like they're happening to someone nearby rather than to you. The man to your left shifts in his sleep, muttering something unintelligible. The bed frames creak with the movement, a sound that's become so familiar it's almost comforting in its consistency. Everything else in your life is uncertain, unstable. But the creak of wooden bed frames in a workhouse dormitory is eternal. You could be in any workhouse in England, in any decade of the 18th century, and you'd hear this exact sound. There's a strange comfort in that, knowing that your misery is part of a larger tradition of institutional suffering. The mainstream historical fact is that workhouses operated on this model for over a century, processing thousands of desperate people through systems remarkably similar to what you're experiencing. The same bell schedules, the same inadequate rations, the same forced labour, the same family separations, refined over decades into an efficient machine for managing poverty, while ensuring the poor remained sufficiently uncomfortable to want to leave. You're not unique. Your suffering isn't special. You're one of thousands experiencing this exact same night in dormitories across England, all lying awake in the dark, all waiting for dawn, all trapped in the same systematic misery. Here's your final quirky tidbit, and it's actually quite dark. Workhouse records show that most inmates stayed for months or years, not weeks. Once you entered the system, leaving was difficult. You needed to find work that paid enough to support yourself, save enough for basic necessities, and convince the master you were reformed enough to release. Many people died in workhouses, their bodies buried in paupers' graves, their lives ending in the same institution where they'd spent their final years. The workhouse wasn't temporary relief. It was, often, a permanent solution to the temporary problem of poverty. You drift back towards sleep, and this time the dreams are quieter. You're walking through a forest, which is odd because you haven't seen a forest in months. The trees are tall, and the air is clean, and there's bread growing on the branches like fruit. Dream logic again, giving you what reality can't. Food, freedom, space, the absence of bells and overseers and institutional control. You eat the breadfruit and it tastes like everything you've been denied. Butter, sweetness, satisfaction, the simple pleasure of enough. The dream fades and you're back in the dormitory, more awake now, aware that dawn is approaching. You can sense it somehow, the way your body knows when the night is ending even without windows or clocks or external cues. The quality of darkness changes, becomes slightly less absolute, and you know that somewhere outside these walls, the sun is thinking about rising, which means the bell is thinking about ringing, which means this whole cycle is about to begin again. You don't move yet. These final minutes before the bell are yours, the only time in the entire day when you're not being actively directed, supervised, controlled. You're lying in bed in the dark, and for these few minutes you can pretend you're somewhere else. You can imagine that when you open your eyes you'll be in a different place, a home, a room that's actually yours, a life that includes possibilities beyond oakum and stones and gruel. But even as you imagine it, you know it's fantasy. When the bell rings, you'll open your eyes and see the same dormitory, the same rows of beds, the same 60 men in various states of sleep and waking. You'll shuffle to the washroom, eat your gruel, pick your oakum, break your stones, eat your inadequate meals, sit through your mandated recreation and religious instruction, and return to this bed to start the whole process again. This is your life now. This is what tomorrow looks like, and the day after, and the day after that. Historians still argue whether the workhouse system succeeded in reducing poverty, or simply managed it more efficiently, whether it reformed people or broke them, whether it was a necessary evil or just evil. But lying here in the pre-dawn darkness, you know the answer. The system doesn't reduce poverty. It processes poor people. It doesn't reform character. It crushes spirit. It doesn't save anyone. It just makes survival so uncomfortable that death starts looking like a reasonable alternative. The man to your right wakes with a gasp, sits up abruptly, then realizes where he is and lies back down. You hear him exhale slowly, the sound of someone remembering their circumstances and accepting them. You understand completely. That moment of waking, that split second before memory returns, when you don't know where you are or why everything hurts, that's the best part of the day. Then reality floods back in and you remember workhouse, poverty, trapped. The knowledge settles over you like your inadequate blanket, and you start the psychological process of preparing to survive another day. You think about the future, which is a dangerous habit. The future in the workhouse is just more of the same, an endless repetition of today, a recursive loop of labor and hunger and institutional control. Unless something changes, unless you find work outside, unless the economy shifts, unless someone dies and leaves you money. Unless. But unless requires hope, and hope is expensive here, priced in calories you don't have, and mental energy that's been consumed by the simple act of surviving. The darkness is definitely lighter now. Not daylight yet, but the promise of it, the threat of it. Soon the bell will ring and this brief interlude of relative peace will end. Soon you'll be upright and moving and performing the elaborate dance of workhouse compliance. Soon you'll be picking oakum with bleeding fingers and breaking stones with aching shoulders and eating gruel that tastes like institutional resignation. But not yet. For these final moments, you're still lying in the dark, still technically at rest, still in possession of the small freedom that comes from not yet being commanded. You breathe slowly, trying to store up these moments of relative autonomy against the coming day of absolute control. You stretch slightly, testing which parts of your body hurt and which parts hurt differently. You listen to the dormitory breathing around you, 60 men in various stages of sleep, all trapped in the same system, all waiting for the same bell. And then, because dawn is inevitable, because time moves forward regardless of your preference, because the workhouse operates on schedules that don't care about your readiness, you hear it. The bell. 5 a.m. Metallic and harsh and absolute. The sound that ends rest and begins labor, that transforms you from person to inmate, that signals the start of another identical day in an indefinite series of identical days. Around you, 60 men stir. The dormitory comes reluctantly to life. Someone curses under their breath. Someone else sighs deeply. The man beside you sits up and immediately starts coughing, a deep rattle that speaks of lungs damaged by hemp dust and stone particles and the general atmosphere of institutional neglect. You open your eyes. The day has begun. Again. And so it continues. Day after day, week after week. The bell rings at 5. The gruel appears at breakfast. The oakum needs picking. The stones need breaking. The system grinds on with or without you, a machine that's been running for decades and will run for decades more, processing poverty into something manageable, measurable, controlled. But somewhere outside these walls, life continues differently. The sun rises over fields you can't see. Markets operate with goods you can't afford. Families gather for meals you can't imagine. The world turns, indifferent to, the workhouse and everyone in it, offering no rescue but also no judgment. Just the simple fact of existing in ways that don't involve bells and gruel and institutional separation. And you survive. Day by day, meal by inadequate meal, you persist. Not because you're strong, necessarily, but because stopping isn't really an option. The body wants to continue. The mind finds ways to retreat. The soul, if it exists, learns to exist in smaller and smaller spaces, compressed like your straw mattress into something harder and more durable than what you started with. So sleep now. Let the workhouse fade into background noise. Let the bells and the rules and the systematic grinding fade into the soft darkness of rest. Tomorrow will be what it will be, identical to today, probably, but that's tomorrow's problem. Tonight, you're here, breathing, existing, surviving. And that's enough. That has to be enough. The dormitory settles around you, 60 men breathing in the darkness. Tomorrow they'll wake and begin again, but tonight, in this moment, they're just sleeping, just resting, just being. And so are you. Close your eyes. Let the weight of exhaustion pull you down into the soft darkness where dreams are possible, and bells don't exist and hunger is just a word instead of a constant companion. Rest now. Whatever tomorrow brings, it can wait. For these hours, you're free. Not free to leave, not free from pain, but free to simply exist without doing, without producing, without being counted or measured or directed. Sleep well. Even here. Especially here. You've earned it.